You found your way back here, to where the boundary between reality and nightmares blurs. Get comfortable. Tonight's horror stories might just keep you up all night. This happened back when I was in college. Spring break had just ended, and I was driving from my parents' house back to my college dorm. The drive itself was about 3 hours. There were a few small towns on the way, but other than that, it was pretty much just endless fields. I started my drive late, around 10:30 p.m. I was still making my way out of the town my parents lived in when I saw a hitchhiker walking on the side of the road. He was a tall, skinny guy carrying a duffel bag. As I got closer, he stuck out his thumb. I honestly felt really bad for the guy, and seeing as he was walking in the same direction I was going, I rolled down my window and asked if he wanted a ride. He named a nearby town and asked if I was going in that direction. I was, so I told him yes and unlocked the door. He got in the front seat, and I realized right away that he was a lot older than I thought, like, at least in his 40s. He kept to himself for a good part of the ride, which I actually didn't mind. I had the radio on, so it wasn't just awkward silence or anything. It wasn't until around 20 minutes into the drive with the guy that I started to think I made a mistake. The guy started clutching his stomach while groaning and complaining that he didn't feel well. He pretty much just hunched himself in the passenger seat, swaying back and forth. I told him to feel free to open up his window for some fresh air, but he never ended up doing it. To say I felt uncomfortable would be an understatement. Like, don't get me wrong, I understand if the dude wasn't feeling well, but here I am driving while just next to me is this guy groaning and swaying back and forth. There weren't really any towns or rest areas nearby. I didn't want to just tell the guy to get out and completely strand him in the middle of nowhere, so I kind of just sat there, trying to focus on the radio. This went on for another 15 minutes when the guy said, "Dude, I really don't feel good. Can you take the third next exit?" This caught me off guard. Not the part about wanting to stop. I was more so expecting him to say that at some point, but the part about the exit. The guy specifically said, "the third next exit." I remember those being his exact words. In the moment, I obviously thought it was weird. If I myself were sick, I would be much quicker to want to just pull onto the side of the road or at least take the very next exit. I asked the guy if he just wanted me to pull to the side of the road real quick, but he sternly told me no. This should have been a clear red flag, but I ultimately reasoned that the specific exit he wanted me to take must have had a rest area I was unaware of, so I agreed. A few minutes later, I took the exit, but absolutely nowhere in sight was any kind of rest area. I started pulling to the side of the road when the guy said, "No, keep going. We should go down a bit further." Again, this should have been a red flag I picked up on, but I did what he said. Eventually, he told me to stop. He got out and, within seconds, disappeared into the darkness. I waited for the guy to come back for a few minutes when I saw 5 hooded figures walking towards my vehicle, only revealed by the light of my headlights. They were clearly carrying weapons and now charging towards my vehicle. I threw the car in drive and started darting in the other direction, but they actually started shooting at me. From what I recall, 5 gunshots were fired, 2 of which hit the back of my car. Even still, I was able to get out of there. I didn't stop the rest of the way back. I did call the police and report it, but I never got any follow-up. When I made it back to my dorm, I found the bullet holes in the back of my car. I think it's worth noting that one of them was only a couple of inches from my tire, which makes me think whoever was shooting was aiming for the tires, but I'll never be able to know for sure. I don't fully know the motives of that hitchhiker that night, but at least to me, it's obvious he intentionally lured me into that specific spot, which, might I remind you, was nowhere near any type of civilization. I have since never picked up another hitchhiker. This took place in November of 2005. Each year, my job would give us 10 vacation days. Seeing as I hadn't yet used any this year, I decided to take a week off to visit different states around the US. To get around, for the most part, I would actually hitchhike, which is something I've done multiple times in the past. Despite all the horrible recognition it gets nowadays, I actually really enjoy doing it. I've met a lot of people through hitchhiking that I still call friends to this day. Anyway, it was around 2:30 p.m. I was walking down the road giving the usual thumbs-up signal hitchhikers typically give. It had been a while since my last ride, and I'll be the first to admit I was getting a little desperate. Eventually, a red pickup truck pulled up next to me. Inside were two men. My best guess is they were in their 40 years old. One of them asked me where I was going, to which I responded. They both looked at each other for a second, then back at me, and signaled me to get in. They seemed normal enough, so I tossed my bag in the back, got in, and shut the door. But I quickly realized the whole floor of the vehicle was completely covered in different types of bullets. Before I had time to even rethink my decision, we were already going 60 down the highway. I tried to engage in some small talk to ease the tension, and it actually sort of worked. But somehow, the topic landed on how one of the guys had just gotten out of prison for aggravated assault. A disturbingly short amount of time later, they started asking me how much money I had. This is when I started to realize I could be in some serious danger. Now, I had been hitchhiking for a couple of days by that point. I didn't look the best, so I tried to play it off that I was homeless and had no money whatsoever. This response was met with complete silence. For the next 30 minutes or so, not a single word was said, though multiple times I would catch the driver looking up at me through the rearview mirror. I honestly just tried to ignore it, something I regret doing to this day. Fast forward 20 minutes, and to my horror, the driver turned off the highway and started down some unpopulated dirt road. I instantly shot up and said, dude, where are we going? After 15 seconds of no response while the car was still driving, I grabbed my bag, unlocked the door, and dove out of the car. Instantly, I looked up to see the red pickup slam on its brakes, shortly after followed by the reverse lights turning on. I cannot explain to you how fast I got up and ran into a nearby cornfield. I ran for 5 minutes when I swear I could hear gunshots behind me. They were clearly distant, but still, I ran for another 5 minutes until I reached the sign for the main highway. I then called the police, explained the situation in my current location, and waited in the cornfield until an officer arrived. I was then driven to the nearest police station, where I filed a police report. Though in terms of descriptions, there wasn't really much I had to give other than two men inside a red pickup truck. I hadn't gotten the license plate number, and I didn't even really see the full faces of the guys or even remember them. The whole situation was no doubt the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I don't completely know what those guys had planned, but I truly believe I could have lost my life that day. While I still hitchhike occasionally, I am now far more cautious in the cars I get into. It was a rainy night and I was driving home from my shift at the late-night diner I work at. It was a quiet shift at work. I had a weird amount of energy still, so I knew I was going to have to pop a melatonin when I got home. I was driving my usual route, a scenic road during the day but majorly dark at night, lacking many light posts. There are occasional little parking lots with cute little strips of stores or family-owned restaurants and shops, and then just stretches of nothingness. And by nothingness, I mean forest. I was passing one of the aforementioned parking lots of a well-known deli, and under a light post was a woman standing out in the rain with her arm held out. She was waving me down. I slowed as I realized it was a slightly older woman who appeared to be in her 50s, maybe. This woman was really tall, like 5 feet 11 inches or 6 feet, but very skinny. I lowered my window and yelled, "Do you need a ride?" She came over to the front door and opened it, chanting how much of a hero I am. I asked where she was heading, and she said just up the road to town. She was soaking wet, getting my car all wet, but I like to think of myself as a good person and I couldn't, in good conscience, leave another woman out there in the cold rain. However, picking up a random man on the other hand would be a different story. The woman seemed sweet, but I noticed as I looked at her while talking to her that she was missing a few teeth, very, very off-putting. I had to now wonder if she were homeless. She didn't smell or look like a homeless person, though, but the rain soaking her and her clothes could have been masking any scent temporarily. Plus, her hair was so wet that what may have usually been scraggly undone hair could now have been weighted down and straightened by the water. Either way, the woman was smiling the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We pulled up to an intersection with a gas station on one corner. I pulled in next to a pump, might as well fill up. I asked her if she wanted anything from inside. I was really doing my good deed for the week. She said, "No thanks, honey," so I went inside to pay the attendant for gas and some spiked seltzers since tomorrow was the weekend. When I got back to my car, the woman was gone. I looked around the gas station lot real quick, but it was tiny, she was gone. She must have run off somewhere. I felt slightly bad, feeling like she was some lost helpless woman, but part of me also felt slightly relieved. I filled up the tank of my SUV and was on my way home. When I got back to the house, I went straight inside my apartment, which is the first level of a 2-family house. There's a tenant upstairs and me. The front door into the foyer was usually left unlocked, then the 2 doors leading to each apartment were locked. I let myself in out of the rain and into my apartment. I set the seltzers down on the counter. I wasn't that tired yet, so I took a melatonin and tried to go to bed. Even with the melatonin, though, I was having a hard time sleeping that night. My mind was kind of going wild with thoughts, a lot of thinking about that woman I picked up earlier and what happened to her. At certain points, I heard slight sounds from outside of my bedroom, but I dismissed them as sounds from the upstairs tenant. Boy, do I wish I had been more suspicious before falling asleep. I woke up in my dark bedroom, something that usually would never happen when I take a melatonin. I usually sleep like a baby through the night. I sat up, feeling drowsy and really thirsty too. I reached over the table next to my bed for my water, and then I saw and heard something across the room from me. I saw someone crouched in the corner of my bedroom behind a clothing dresser, with their legs folded. I had to be hallucinating it. I shook my head violently and made weird noises. I even slapped myself in the face, and now whoever was in the corner stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream, I didn't say a word. I sat in my bed in literal shock. The part that had me questioning my sanity for a bit after the figure was gone was that there wasn't a single sound from outside the room after this, no footsteps, not the sound of a door closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up, confused why I was calling so late. I told him what I just saw, and he said, "Carter, you probably just had a night terror." I stayed on the phone with him as I was continuing to become more awake. I left my room and turned on the lights to the living room outside. It was a small space. There was no one in there. I looked around the entire space and could confirm no one was there. I started to believe that maybe I did just hallucinated, but still, I slept with the bedroom door locked that night. When I woke up in the morning, I drank some coffee and got dressed for the gym. I went to open the door to the foyer and realized it was already unlocked. My heart sank. Last night, what I saw, was it real? I did another look around the apartment, confirming no one was inside. I went out to my car and opened the back door to put my gym bag in the back seat, and that's when I noticed the damp yellow-brownish stains all over the floor in the back, and my blanket that I always had back there was gone. I wanted to cry or scream. I figured it out. That woman snuck into the back seat last night when I was in the gas station. She either somehow unlocked the door to my apartment, or I mistakenly left it unlocked. I called my dad again, frantically asking him what to do. He said, check and make sure nothing was stolen, and if nothing was, then calling the police really wouldn't do anything. I checked the house and didn't find anything to be missing, just my blanket from the car. I skipped the gym that day. In fact, I stayed bottled up in my apartment for a while after that. I was just genuinely disturbed. I didn't want to live there for much longer after that, and so after that month, I found a new place to live. This happened a few months ago, and I don't know why I agreed, but I decided to go with my friend Elias to a house party he was attending during our first year of high school, even though I wasn't even invited. Elias was able to pull some strings, and I accepted the invitation knowing that I wouldn't be able to drive. I made the choice to go with Elias. When we arrived at the home late at night, Elias told me to leave my phone in the car. He explained that maybe I could lose it or someone I don't know could try and take it from me while I'm not looking. At first, I was confused. I simply nodded, and we got out of the car. I went with Elias into the home's backyard where the party was taking place. I glanced around the backyard and saw people engaging in various activities such as smoking, drinking, and possibly even doing drugs in small groups. Elias had encouraged me to go mingle and say hello to a few people. After a few hours, I realized I had had way too much to drink because my vision was completely foggy. After getting closer to the house, I leaned against the wall to support myself. As I did so, I noticed the time on my watch indicated that it was either midnight or 1:30 in the morning. I knew it was time to leave, so I set out to find Elias. Despite my overwhelming need to collapse, I scanned the yard for him, but I was unable to locate him or see him. When I asked a few others if they'd seen Elias, they all said they had not. I decided to call Henry to find out where he was, so I reached inside my pocket to feel for my phone, but it wasn't there. I cursed myself in the back of my mind because I realized that I had left my phone in Elias's car. It had disappeared with him. I realized there was only one way to get home, which was walking. I remembered my house wasn't too far from this house, but the night was chilly because it was fall. I thought about just asking someone else to take me home, but I didn't know anyone else who could help, so I stuck with my idea of walking home in the darkness by myself. I then got to the road and started stumbling down the street. I knew I had too many drinks because I felt lightheaded and dizzy. A few minutes later, I made it to the main area of the street and kept walking. I lazily started thinking about a bunch of different things, like why did Elias decide to leave me alone at the party, or why I decided to listen to Elias's idiotic idea of leaving my phone in his car so I couldn't call him or anyone else. I started cursing myself for being so careless with my drinking and even getting drunk when I knew I shouldn't have done that. I stopped walking on the side of the road because I was getting tired and crossed my arms over my chest tightly to keep myself warm. Then I remembered something I could do, which was hitchhiking. I held out my arm and stuck out my thumb, hoping someone could see me. I watched as a couple of cars drove past me. They wouldn't stop. As minutes ticked by, I started feeling uneasy, thinking I would have to start walking again. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning, and there were a few cars driving past me, but no one was stopping because they either didn't notice me or didn't care. I hesitated and thought about walking home again, but I realized that in my drunken state, it would be too daunting. I was still holding out my thumb when a gray truck pulled up and stopped in front of me. I smiled as I stumbled towards the vehicle. The window rolled down, and an older-looking man with a beard asked me if I needed a ride. I told him yes, and then told him where my house was before getting into the truck, feeling grateful for the ride. As we started driving down the road, the man began trying to make small talk with me, asking what happened to me. However, I was too disoriented to have an actual conversation with him, and the only things I could manage to say were low mumbling or just murmurs and groans. As we turned the corner onto my street away from the party, I started feeling uneasy for some reason. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was strange about this man. Suddenly, we drove past my house, and I told the man that we had just driven past it. I felt my gut telling me to get out, but I couldn't because I was too drunk to move. I was about to tell the man to let me out before we got too far away from my house when suddenly the man turned to me, and I noticed he had a sinister look on his face. "You know you shouldn't be drunk while you're hitchhiking because you'd make a very easy target," the man said, smirking darkly. The man reached over and started rubbing my leg. I didn't know what he was trying to do, but I knew it probably wasn't anything good. But before he could do anything else to me, we both heard a loud siren behind the car, and then a flashing red and blue light flooded the night. I realized it was the police, and I jumped for joy inside. The man panicked and stopped, unlocking the doors, which allowed me to jump out of the car. I ran as fast as I could, and the police officer rushed over to me. I told him the entire story about what happened to me. Unfortunately, nothing illegal happened per se at that point. The police officer told me that he was looking for someone in a gray truck who had apparently stolen something from a store. I'm not sure if it was the man who picked me up or someone else, but I was just glad the police officer stopped the car. A cop gave me a ride home, and I decided from then on I wouldn't get so drunk that I couldn't think straight. I now know the importance of being responsible and staying aware of my surroundings, even when having a good time. I was still in college when this happened. I went to a big party school in upstate New York. I wasn't in a sorority, but I attended a lot of the frat parties still. I had a heavy drinking phase in college, unfortunately, but I guess it's good that I got it out of my system. There was an upcoming frat party that my friends Verity and Ellie wanted to go to. I was not one to ever say no to a party unless I was already deathly hungover, and even then, I'd sometimes be known to still go out. I was living in a house off campus with 3 other girls. We were not a sorority house or team house or anything like that, just 4 friends renting a house together. I believe it was a Adam Sandler party that we were going to. The house was about 20 minutes away from campus. We pre-gamed pretty heavily at our house and then called an Uber, which we all split. On the Uber ride there, we pre-gamed some more, which was a recipe for disaster. By the time we showed up to the party, I was borderline blacked out. I barely remember the layout of that house. I'd never been to a frat party besides that night. It's weird, I have short spans of memory from that night. I vaguely remember the outside, that there were a bunch of frat guys standing out front of the house, and then I remember the DJ in the living room and the 2 beer pong tables in the kitchen. I was later told that I played beer pong with some random frat guy and ended up talking to him in a corner for a big chunk of the night. But after that, nobody knows where I went. I couldn't even tell you the last thing I remember before waking up sleeping on the grass on the side of the road. In a daze, my head was throbbing. I had to still be somewhat intoxicated. It was pitch black outside. I was laying by a bunch of trees, like a wooded area apart from the university. There wasn't much up there besides woods and the occasional little town. There were a couple of light posts further down the road, so I wasn't just laying in complete darkness. I patted down my pockets looking for my phone and had a meltdown when I realized my pockets were empty. I was also missing my crossbody bag. I had absolutely nothing on me and started to freak out. I couldn't even call for help, let alone check the time or where I was. I looked around the immediate area by where I was sleeping, nothing. My white shirt was stained with dirt, but that was the least of my worries. I started walking down the road closer to the light posts and began to realize there were no buildings in sight. I was on some completely random back road. I leaned on the light pole for a few minutes, wondering what to do. I decided I'd wait for someone to pass by and ask for help. It took a long time, though at least 20 minutes, before I noticed headlights down the road. I stepped out onto the road, waving my arms and jumping, trying to ensure I got their attention. The cars slowed to a stop on the side of the road. I approached the car, and the guy inside rolled down the window. Once he asked me if I was all right, I told him I was stranded without a phone and needed a ride home. He told me to get in, and I did, making sure to let him know how much I appreciated it. He, of course, asked me about my predicament, how I found myself stranded on the side of the road. I told him I was at a party, and the next thing I remembered was waking up on the side of the road. In hindsight, I should not have said any of that. I should have been as vague as possible and not let this guy know that I got completely trashed and was vulnerable. He asked why I didn't call for help, and I told him I lost my cell phone too. I looked back at him for a second, and this was the first time I really analyzed his features. He was about 40, not the best-looking guy, with a thin goatee and a big nose. I gave him my address to put into his house as he drove. He put the address in and then I heard him say under his breath, "Okay, here we go." I asked how far away we were, and he said about 15 minutes. That sounded about right since the frat house was about 15 minutes from our house. I thought things would go smoothly. I'd get dropped off at the house where Ellie and Verity would be waiting for me with my belongings. But nothing can ever go that smoothly. The man spoke in a gentle voice basically the entire time. He was asking basic questions. At first, his soft voice was almost, in a weird way, off-putting, like why was he talking in an almost whisper in the car? We drove on and on for what seemed like over 15 minutes on the same road. I started to get concerned and asked him how much further we had. He didn't respond right away, so I said, "Sir," and he went, I repeated my question, and he said in his soft voice, "Not far." This wasn't right. Our house is in town, yet we were still on the same back road with nothing but trees everywhere. I started noticing in my peripheral vision that he would look at me multiple times, like he'd move his whole head to stare at me for a few seconds and then look back at the road. I was starting to feel sick. I asked him if he put the right address in, and he said yes. Then he asked, "What color underwear are you wearing?" as he put his hand on my knee and started rubbing it. I moved it away and told him in a desperate voice to please not hurt me, I just wanted to get home safe. He said, "Why would I hurt you?" After saying this, he pulled onto the grass on the side of the road and put the car in park. He was about to lean over towards me and do something, like put his arms around me, but I didn't let him. I opened the door and ran into the woods. Luckily, I was wearing my Air Forces, so I didn't have a hard time running in the woods. I ran only just enough to be out of sight from the car. When I could no longer see its headlights, I heard the man for the first time raising his voice. He yelled into the woods, "Where you at?" "I just want to." I put my hands over my mouth, not only to muffle my breathing but because of pure fear. I waited and waited until I heard a car door slam shut and the sound of a car speeding off. I waited a few more moments before walking back to the road, confirming he was gone. I felt truly helpless. I didn't want to run into that man again, but I also needed someone else to help me. I waited just at the edge of the woods for another car to come, and eventually, one did. I saw the headlights approaching from afar, but I waited until I was sure it was a different car before jumping out and waving my arms and yelling. The car came to a stop. It was another man, a little older. I sat in the back seat. This time, I was so shaken up that I hardly spoke apart from answering whatever questions about my predicament he asked. Thankfully, this man dropped me off at the house. It was like 4 a.m. at this point. My friends were still awake waiting for me. They had my phone and my bag. They were contemplating calling the police if I didn't come back by morning. No one had any clue who I left with or how I ended up on the side of the road. The boy I was with claims he wasn't the one who left with me. In fact, there's no solid proof that I even left with anyone, but that leaves no explanation for how I ended up sleeping on the side of the road. I cut back heavily on the drinking after this night and never want to be in a situation again where I have to hitchhike. Out of the dark forest, I was hitchhiking from Liege, Germany, to Paris. He was a French man, a somewhat dirty and unshaven driver, small and shabby. He agreed to give me a ride in his car, a ride with him to Paris where I needed to pick up. My paintings were from an exhibition I had there. It was October, I was 30 years old, and he seemed about the same age. He spoke broken English, I spoke no French at all. I really didn't have a clue who this guy was. The day was mild, sunny, and blue. It was a warm and comfortable French day, a great day to hitchhike. It was around 4:30 p.m. when I met him at a gas station somewhere in France. I hopped into his little old car, happy to have scored a ride. We drove off to Paris on the main highway. After some small talk, mainly about where I'm from, he reached over my lap and opened the glove compartment. He pulled out what looked like a bunch of passports. They were passports. He handed me all four. The first was a pretty girl who was his girlfriend and had died falling off the back of his motorcycle, he said. The second was a girlfriend who had died in a car crash. He told me the third girlfriend died from a brain tumor and the fourth fell off a horse. He said, "I'm such an unlucky man." I agreed he was unlucky. The uneasiness started then and only grew as the miles rolled on. He was in possession of 4 young women's passports. Soon after showing me the passports, the man said he wanted to take a shortcut to Paris. It wasn't really a question to me. Excellent, I thought, get me out of here ASAP. I assumed we would cut through some charming French villages on secondary roads, past houses and farms, but no. Instead, we turned off onto an implausible dirt road off the main highway. Oh, I thought. Not good, but I kept silent. Why we keep quiet is a mystery, perhaps because of our dumb manners. At first, the road was out in the open through a field. We rolled over the typically vivid green French hillside until we finally reached the oncoming heavy woods. The road narrowed. It grew instantly darker as we entered the forest. The interior of the forest was creepy. The woods looked like the perfect place to hide something. I still found the woods beautiful and dreadful. It was at this point that my French driver shouted in broken English, "I don't want to speak English anymore." This was definitely not a request. Then silence, uncomfortable silence in the darkening forest. I started to feel a small trickle of adrenaline in my body. My fight-or-flight instinct was warming up. Communication had now officially ended, just silence. I pondered this because I knew I would surely have questions as we would get deeper and deeper into the thickening woods. I knew, though, that I wouldn't ask anything. Nothing. It was now 5 p.m., and the sun was fading fast. The woods grew darker. The driver seemed so tense, and I could tell he was in deep thought. I noticed his lips moving almost imperceptibly. They were rigid, snake-like. I myself had moved my hand to the car door handle, a movement I'm sure could not have been missed. The car was slowing down. It did not say a word. Was I going to die now? Did he have a gun? All these questions ran through my head. My life was now surreal. This was not my plan. Maybe I communicated with my captor in some secret way. Maybe I gave off some kind of male pheromone perceptible only to men. Facing off, I possessed my own rage issues, and I was not going down without a fight. That I knew. There would be no begging or cries of mercy from me, not to this. I also had my own secret store of crazy. I was big and strong at that time, rode tough through my travels, and there's no substitute for my nothing-to-lose stare. That is all I gave him. Something very primitive transpired between us then. I think rather quickly, in a matter of seconds, it's a sort of inner calculus as to whether one can overcome, stop, or kill the other guy or not, and all its peripheral considerations, not the least blood, gore, strength, and alas, dying. I don't think these calculations are the same when the victim is small and scared, begging and weak. I think between those two uneven people, it just becomes bloodlust, power, panic, scratching, and doom. 5:12 p.m. The car was now moving really slow. I entered a very strange and new place in myself. I was transformed with very little preparation, transformed into a potential killer myself, maybe. My chauffeur could read my mind, or my body language, or sense my intent, or see my hand on his dirty door handle. It was the moment of truth, and then we suddenly started to speed up. Thank God. Out of those woods. Odd how these memories have come back to me as I write this. Some memories I'm not certain of. Like, did he say he had to hit one girlfriend with a shovel because she attacked him and would not be quiet and leave him in peace? Did he really explain the 2 backpacks on the back seat? Did I not hear that on purpose? Did I later imagine those words? Did I see more passports in his glove box than the 4 he pulled out? Why didn't I say, stop the car, after the passport show? The road began to widen, and we emerged out of the dark forest into the setting sun, dark red and orange in the sky. I could hear and then see the highway. Now I saw tiny houses across the highway. I had no idea where exactly I was. The Frenchman asked me if I wanted to spend the night at his house. We could eat dinner together. A quick film of his filthy torture chamber basement ran through my head. I politely said no. My first word spoken since the order not to speak English. I sincerely think that had I broken that command and blabbered something in the woods, my story might have had a different ending. It all came down to silence. I can be silent sometimes. One needs to be to contemplate the next move. Maybe one of the faces in the passports may not have been able to spring over her nature and started to talk or beg with fear. Would that have fed the killer's darkness as evil? Who really knows? I got out at the side of the highway, and with night settling in, I watched him drive away. I never went to the police because I didn't speak French, and I thought maybe my imagination was just too damn active. I yelled something into the night sky, just wondering what the hell had just happened. It was fully dark now. I was exhausted after that little adventure and soon fell asleep on the side of the highway. The next morning, I was worried about what the new day would bring. I looked at my hands, wondering if I was still alive. Jump ahead 20 years, and I'm teaching a German business student English in a cafe on a boulevard in Liege, Germany. For whatever reason, we discussed the topic of hitchhiking, and I tell him my story. My student promptly whips out his smartphone and Googles French serial killers. Then he shows me pictures. There he was. I was shown a photo of serial killer Patrice Allegre. It was him, all those years ago, me and him on that strange ride. I had never forgotten his face. At that time, in 1990, there was a reported serial killer leaving bodies of girls on the French roadsides and highways. He was in the midst of his killing hobby back then. I had heard about a killer on the loose. My French girlfriend told me to be careful hitchhiking. I've often wondered if the murdered women and other men may have been buried in those woods we passed through slowly. I now wish I had gone to the police and have since subsequently tried. He's in jail, and they're not interested. Maybe I could have helped stop more murders back then. That's heavy on my soul. Since then, I've felt the dark light in my body. Maybe the souls of the girls escaped with me, desperate to get out of the forest. When I was 29 years old, I had saved enough money to buy my first house. It wasn't anything special, and honestly, all things considered, it wasn't in the best neighborhood either. But I was still proud of the accomplishment nonetheless. I'd met all the nearby neighbors within the first 2 weeks I moved in. Considering the neighborhood, I was surprised to discover they all actually seemed pretty nice. A couple of them even invited me over for dinner a few times, and having lived in different apartments all my life, this wasn't really something I was used to. Of course, they weren't all like this. However, 2 houses down from the house I moved into lived a man that was probably 50 years old. Upon moving in, every other night or so, the dude would knock at my front door at some absurd hour asking for stuff. For example, the first time it happened, he asked me to find any spare bread I wasn't going to eat. Another time, he asked me if I could fill up a bucket with water because his was turned off. It was just random but somewhat understandable things like that. But I drew the line when he started asking me for money. I figured I had no obligation to be constantly meeting this guy's needs. I mean, I had pretty much just met the dude. I started opening the door to his knocks less and less, but this didn't seem to have any effect on the number of times he would show up. Fast forward to a night a few weeks later, and again, another knock. I planned to ignore it like I'd grown accustomed to doing by that point, but as I looked through the peephole, I noticed the guy looked distressed. Seeing this, I decided the right thing to do would be to open up the door. So I did. I asked him what he needed, and what he responded with was not at all the type of response I was expecting. He asked me if I could come over and show him how to use his new grill. Now, this happened around midnight, which in my opinion was an extremely odd time to start grilling. But against my better judgment, I decided I would help him. I was pretty into cooking at that point in my life and figured taking 10 minutes to show the guy how a grill worked wouldn't be the end of the world. I told him that I'd be over in a second and that I just needed to put some shoes on. He thanked me and started walking back. A couple of minutes later, I made my way over to his house. I opened some gate and walked into his backyard. It was dark, so it was hard to see, but it was clear there was no grill. On top of that, the guy was nowhere in sight, although his back door was wide open. I stuck my head inside and yelled out for the guy. "Yeah, I'm down here. I need your help getting some meat from the freezer." The muffled response came from down a set of stairs just to the left of me. I was hesitant to go down. There were no lights on down there. In fact, there wasn't a single light on throughout the whole house. I yelled down the stairs, asking him if he could turn on a light so I could see. There was silence for a few seconds. Eventually, he responded, "No, they're broken. I can't do that." I knew something was off at that point. I yelled back something like, "I think I'm just gonna go, man." I kid you not, the second after I said this, audible footsteps started sprinting up the stairs. My flight reaction kicked in immediately. I ran directly back to my house and locked the door behind me. I pulled back a set of curtains and looked out one of my windows, but I didn't see anything. I was terrified. I thought about calling the police, but decided against it, figuring I really wouldn't be able to prove anything that just happened. For the next few days, I didn't leave my house for anything except work. During those days, I never saw the guy nor did any late-night knocks occur. Exactly 1 week after it happened, I was talking with my neighbor across the street. The conversation eventually landed on what I experienced and how I was planning to move because of it. But I was just met with a look of confusion. I was then informed that no one lived in the house I was talking about. It had been abandoned for 2 years. This prompted my neighbor to call the police. However, the police would find nothing inside or around the house. I moved out a few weeks later, so that's all I know. I'm not sure if anything else came from the situation or not. I still don't know who that guy was or what he was trying to lure me into. This happened during the summer before my sophomore year in college. At that time, I was doing a lot of research for a place I could live during the coming school year that was close to campus. I found multiple good-looking apartments, but all of them were way out of my budget. I quickly figured out that if I wanted to live close to campus, I would need a roommate that could help pay each month's rent. I posted an ad on Craigslist explaining my situation, hoping someone would be interested. Not even an hour after I posted the ad, I got a response. Apparently, it was some older lady in her 70s. I was kind of expecting it to be another student from my university, but I figured it didn't really matter. As long as they were willing to pay half of the rent, I didn't really care. Plus, I didn't get any further responses in the next week, so I took the one opportunity one was given. Fast forward to the start of the school semester, and the two of us moved in. She introduced herself as Wilfred. She was short and had white hair. Although a little quiet, she seemed nice. I figured we'd get along fine, so I wasn't too worried about the coming months. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We had the occasional small talk conversation when we were both in the kitchen, but that was about it. For the most part, she would spend all her time in her bedroom. Occasionally, while I was watching TV in the living room at night, I would hear this high-pitched giggling coming through the walls. The first few times it happened, I just assumed she was on her phone or something. But then I realized I never actually heard her talking. It was just her giggling. I couldn't imagine what she was doing. Over time, things just kept getting weirder. For example, she would start coming out of her room for no other purpose than to watch me. She would stand in the kitchen or hallway just looking at me while I watched TV or made myself dinner. Needless to say, I was getting more and more uncomfortable around her. One night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. to the sound of slight knocking on my bedroom door. Not knocking like trying to get my attention, but slow, soft, and barely audible knocking. I yelled out Wilfred's name, and right as I did, the knocking stopped. I knew it was her because shortly after, I heard her same giggling followed by footsteps walking back to her room. I'd be lying if I said this didn't freak me out. I didn't have a lock on my door, so nothing was stopping her from coming into my room while I was sleeping. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. I had planned on confronting her about this situation the next day, but she never left her room once. Come night again, I decided to move my desk in front of my door as a makeshift barricade because, again, I didn't have a lock on my door and I did not feel comfortable having nothing stopping her from entering my room. 3 hours later, I woke up to the sound of my desk being hit by my door from someone attempting to open it. It was Wilfred. I could see her eye peeking through the crack of the slightly open door. Before I could even say anything, she started screaming and banging on my door. My desk started to give way, so I got out of bed and held the door closed myself. The screaming and banging went on for 2 more minutes. Once it finally stopped, I got up and called the police. When they arrived, I opened the door to my bedroom and my heart dropped. Every single one of the knives from our kitchen had been stabbed into the door. I was absolutely horrified, but I tried to compose myself. I briefly explained the situation to the 2 officers that arrived. I also told them which room Wilfred was in. She would provide a struggle in being detained, but they would ultimately take her away. The next month, I moved to another apartment, this time with some actual students from my university. I still don't understand what made Wilfred do what she did. My best guess is she had some severe untreated condition she wasn't on medication for, but then again, maybe not. Maybe she seriously intended to use those knives on me in my sleep. But because I took the precaution of pushing my desk in front of my door, I luckily didn't have to find out. About 3 months ago, I moved into an apartment with 2 other women so I could attend college. There's a list of things that make the building we live in not that great. For example, most apartment rooms face the corridor where people from the same floor as you will constantly walk left and right to get in or out of the building. So if you keep your windows open, anyone pacing outside can see into your room. But considering I spend most of my time at college, and the girls I live with and most of the neighbors are really nice, the things on that list don't really bother me that much. A few nights ago, while getting ready to go to bed, I could hear music playing from somewhere, mostly pop songs from the 2000s. Since we live in a student-friendly city full of frat houses and the like, I thought nothing of it. There were probably a bunch of parties going on, and the sound was coming from one of them. Or maybe it was just some drunk friends listening to it on the street. I got into bed and let a random video play on my phone so I could fall asleep, as I often do. But as I was starting to doze off, I started to hear drilling noises. At first, I thought I was just sleepy and hearing things, or maybe it was coming from my phone. But I paused the video and listened closely. There was definitely someone using a drill somewhere nearby. I got up and walked around the apartment, feeling confused. It was around 10:30 p.m., so there was no way that someone could be working still. The sound was louder at my bedroom window, so I opened it to check and quickly realized that it was coming from the neighboring apartment, the one that's closest to my window. At that moment, I realized that music was also coming from there. No one lives in that specific apartment, so my confusion only grew. But then I figured maybe someone had planned to rent it, talked it over with the landlord, and he ordered for something in it to be fixed. Still, the fact that they were doing it so late into a Thursday felt really strange. I went back to trying to sleep, but they wouldn't stop making noise. I was texting a friend and eventually started complaining about it, sending him audios and even a video directed at the window that all the noise was coming from. He said I should call the police because there was no way it was legal for someone to be doing this, especially in a building full of apartments. I decided against it since I just wanted to get some rest, and it was already past midnight by then. I forced myself to sleep through the drilling sounds, but a little past 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke up again, this time to hammering. Feeling stressed, but not enough to take action just yet, I tried to sleep once more, only to wake up again. This time, I didn't even check what time it was. I was totally fed up, so I just put on a robe and made my way to confront whoever it was. The window to the apartment was open, so I decided to talk to those people from there. The window was located above the stairs, though, so I would have to go down a few steps to get into view, and I'd look even shorter being seen from there. But that was the last thing on my mind. As soon as I got to the window, I felt most of the courage leave me. In that room, there were 4 men who all seemed to be around their 30s or 40s, and they all stopped whatever they were doing to look at me. Now only the song coming from the radio could be heard, and somehow it felt chilling to have all those other noises stop so abruptly. Even though that's everything I wanted just seconds earlier, I definitely didn't want to be the one thing these 4 men were focused on. Another thing that bothered me, but I didn't think about until the next day, was those men's peculiar choice of music. It just felt creepy to realize that middle-aged men were listening to stuff that teenagers or even preteens would be listening to. Anyway, none of them looked shocked to see me. They just had puzzled looks. Remembering why I was there in the first place, I said, "Excuse me, it's pretty late and most people here have work early in the morning. If it's not too much to ask, can you guys do this some other time?" Now, mind you, I'm a pretty short and puny 19-year-old who didn't even think to put on something other than a robe. So when 2 of those 40-something-year-old men came to the window and towered over me, looking up and down at my body almost like predators, I froze up and felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They were both sweaty and had their mouths agape, and one of them had a hammer that looked quite heavy in his hand. They started smiling in a sick, twisted way, and I felt a sudden urge to throw up. Extremely unsettled, I started slowly making my way back to my apartment, not taking my eyes off the men, feeling like they might try to grab me. When I got to the last step of the stairs and close enough to the window, as soon as I was out of their view, I dashed to my front door, got inside, and locked it. One of the girls who lives with me was out of town that night, and I presumed the other one was asleep since she hadn't seen my text on our group chat asking them if anyone had moved into that apartment. I got back into my room and didn't hear any tools again. In reality, even the radio seemed to have been turned off. I wasn't really sure how to feel about that because now I wasn't angry, just disgusted and creeped out. I know I should have called the cops by then, but I was just too stressed to deal with that any longer. Checking the time, it was about 2:15 now. I got into bed again, tricking myself into thinking I wasn't scared, just craving some sleep. Eventually, I passed out. I woke up in the middle of the night again. This time it was around 3 o'clock, and I could hear no sounds coming from the apartment. Everything was quiet, and that quickly started to bother me. It was too quiet. I had to have heard or felt something in order to wake up. The silence was making me uneasy, and I had a feeling that someone might have been on the other side of my closed window. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't get a peaceful sleep after that. The next morning, as I was going out, I went past the same window and noticed that it was closed. It was as if this previous night had never even happened. But I asked the girl who was home with me if she heard anything. She said she had woken up several times during the night but couldn't get up and do something about it due to sleep paralysis. Either way, that confirmed I wasn't delusional. Those people really were there. But then how did they have the keys to the building and that apartment? Why did it seem like they didn't want to be seen during the day? What were they thinking of doing to me or maybe any passerby? It's been a week now, and thankfully I haven't seen those men again. Still, I have no idea who they were or what they were doing, and I'm honestly scared to even think about the possibility that they might come back or still be lurking around. I live in a pretty basic suburban town on Long Island, New York. My girlfriend Valerie and I recently started renting a small house, perfect for 2 to 4 people. We have a decent-sized backyard, and our house is on a very quiet street. One side of our house has a water drainage basin, as the county calls it, which is just a bunch of trees surrounding a sump. On the other side is our neighbor Neil, who lives with his wife. They're a bit older, in their 60s, and quiet. Then directly across the street is a little patch of woods that's in front of another water drainage basin. So for people who like privacy out front, our house is perfect. But then there's the backyard. Neil's house is blocked off by some bushes that the landlord planted years ago, so besides the house directly behind us over the fence, there are no other houses that could see into the yard. However, that one house looking into our backyard was all it took to genuinely make Valerie and I uncomfortable. As I'm writing this, it's currently the fall, so we've been doing fall cleanup the past few weeks in the front and backyard. I started noticing that any time we were out there, there were these 2 people standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. It was a middle-aged man and woman. When I'd look up to that window, they'd keep looking and watching me. It got really uncomfortable to the point we pretended not to notice it, but we could only stomach doing this for so long. The leaves kept falling day by day, and the fall cleaning would need to continue. Valerie wouldn't want to be in the yard anymore because she was getting so creeped out at those 2 people who would watch us out the window without fail. So one foggy day while raking, I looked up at the window and once again, the 2 were standing at the big rectangular window. I decided to wave at them to see if they'd wave back. After a few seconds of smiling and waving, they didn't move. No reaction, but I could feel their stares and I could see their eyeballs looking at me. I turned away from the window and tried to continue raking, but after sneaking a peek back at the window a couple of minutes later and seeing them still there, I felt too awkward and weird being out there. I went inside. Valerie said we should go over and introduce ourselves. At first, I was hesitant about that, but I was persuaded to walk around the block with her to that house and ring the bell. We expected one of those people at the window to answer the door, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to see half of a person's head. It didn't look like either of those people who were always at the window. It was also super dark in the house to the point that it looked incredibly ominous and uncanny staring at half of that person's face. This guy looked a lot younger, like in his 22-year-old. Valerie and I tried to be friendly and introduce ourselves. The guy seemed very closed off though and not interested in speaking. He had a very, "what do you need" type of attitude about him. When I asked if he lives with anyone else here, like his parents, he said no. I mentioned the man and woman who were always at the window upstairs, and the guy on the other side of the doors said he doesn't know who I'm talking about. Valerie and I felt really unsettled, so we just left. But weirdly, as we walked down the walkway back to the sidewalk, I noticed the guy behind the door was still peering half of his face through the cracked open door. I'm sure he watched us walk away until we were out of sight. That interaction was weirder and creepier than we were expecting. When we got back home, I went upstairs to our room. The upstairs of our house is only our master bedroom and a bathroom. It has 2 windows. One of the windows looks over to that house over the fence. I looked out the window to see those 2 people looking out the window again, and even at this distance, I felt like they were staring right at me. I shut the blinds and went down to tell Valerie. We agreed it was time to plant some arborvitaes to block their window from view. The only problem is it's already the fall, and it's too late to plant any kind of trees. We have to make it through winter. After a few days of not looking outside the bedroom window or going into the backyard, one night we heard a strange knocking sound from downstairs. I told Valerie to wait in bed while I went downstairs. The knocking got louder, and I quickly discovered it wasn't the sound of knocking on one of the doors, but rather on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds of it were, of course, shut because we didn't want those creepy people looking into our living room at night. I approached it, and yes, it was 100% a fist knocking on the glass. I considered saying, "Who's there?" but I froze, and I was too scared. Instead, I flicked on the backyard light, and then the knocking stopped. I didn't even want to look out the window or door. I kept the light on and then went back upstairs to my room where I told Valerie about the creepy knocking. But I claimed that I chased whoever it was away. I exaggerated in fear of sounding like a coward. I also didn't want her to worry. We both imagined it to have been something to do with that house though. Nothing has happened since, but I'll have to update throughout the winter. Update: it's been 2 weeks, and we haven't seen those people at the window ever since. But last night, we heard yelling and screaming from that house. I had to open our window, and it became clear there were muffled yells coming from that house. The fact that we heard it through 2 sets of closed windows just goes to show how loud the yelling was. Then, out of nowhere, it just stopped and went quiet. We almost called the police, but ultimately didn't. I'll update again if anything else happens, but we're really getting creeped out here now. My childhood was normal and nothing out of the ordinary. 2 middle-class, hard-working parents just getting by in a nice city, and then of course, me and my little brother. He's 6 years younger than me and he was at my grandma's house when this happened. My mom was at work, working a double shift, and my father was also working. He was a truck driver, so oftentimes he would spend weeks away from the house. My mom also worked a lot to cope with the fact that my father was always gone. I think it made us all a little bit sad sometimes, but really, our family was very close and we always had a great time together when we were able to finally hang out. Sometime during the night, it wasn't too late yet, but definitely starting to get dark. My mom wasn't going to be home for a few more hours, and I was getting pretty bored with nothing to do. I was pacing back and forth through the house, just trying to figure out how to cure my boredom. I sat down on the couch and began looking for something to watch on TV, but nothing was catching my eye. Shortly after, I went and grabbed my PS4 from my bedroom so I could play Madden football out in the living room since the TV was twice as big as mine. As I was hooking up my PlayStation, I felt something weird inside. As soon as I looked up, there was a face smothered in the window right in front of me, staring directly at me. I froze and screamed. Then the man also started screaming. He started yelling for help and to let him inside, just over and over. I had no idea who he was or what he was doing, but he was practically begging and screaming at the top of his lungs. I couldn't move a muscle because I was just so scared. Sounds weird, but I almost let him in despite me being that scared. I was just unsure of what to do. He was a big scary man, but he appeared to be in danger. Thankfully, my mom pulled into the driveway as this was happening. I was so relieved to see her, but also terrified that the man might try to hurt her. He stopped like a deer in headlights, and my mom yelled at him to leave, and he did. Thankfully, my mom called the cops when she got inside. When they showed up, the man was sitting across the street on the curb in front of a foreclosed house. The cops found him there and asked him questions. He stuck with his story, though, and said that a group of men in ski masks tried to kidnap him and that they beat him senseless. For some reason, I just didn't believe that. The cop didn't really seem to either, to be honest, but there was nothing the officer could do technically. We later found out that the man was our new neighbor, and he had just bought that house that was foreclosed right across from us. It was a good thing that my mom showed up like an hour before I expected her to that night. That guy still lives next to my parents, and I lived there for a few more years after this incident. He never necessarily bothered us again after that, but man, he was a creeper. We had to live by his word and take what he said as the truth. Even though it seemed unlikely, we had no choice but to accept it. Nothing outlandish happened with him after this, but there were times I was very uncomfortable by his presence. He used to smile and wave at me whenever I walked past his house, and he always seemed to be outside watching when I got off the school bus. There were also times I heard him having full-on conversations with himself, and I swear I even saw him hitting himself in the head while doing so a few times. He liked to randomly scream in the middle of the night like bloody murder. There was definitely something wrong with him, so we always did our best to keep our distance. My dad really disliked him, probably even more than my mother and I. Violence really was not a thing in our neighborhood, and I mean that literally. So his story was just weird. The last thing I want to mention is when I saw his face the first time. He wasn't cut up or bleeding like he was when the police found him. I genuinely believe he did that to himself to make himself look like a victim. It sounds crazy, but I know there are people out there crazy enough to do that. My boyfriend and I used to live in a small house that we were renting at the time. We were young and it was our first place, so we needed something affordable. We found a place for just $700. It was a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, 900 square foot house. It was in a really rough part of town, but we thought if we minded our business, kept our noses down, and stayed alert, that we'd be fine. It was nothing fancy at all, but it was still more than what we needed. We both had jobs, only being paid $10 to $15 an hour, and we were both also full-time college students. So we were out of the house more than we were home, especially my boyfriend. He worked as a garbage man and got lots of overtime. He would get to work around 7 a.m. and sometimes wouldn't be home until 7:30 or 8 o'clock. Whereas I, on the other hand, worked at a salon for a new and upcoming small local business. I was paid under the table there, so it helped with taxes and the lack of hours I was working. My boyfriend, whose name is Arnold, by the way, took night classes for college. He was studying law but later changed to business after just a year. That's not really the point, but the point I'm trying to make is that he was hardly ever home, mostly to eat and sleep. Even on the weekends, he worked a part-time job for extra money. I would always have dinner ready for him every night so he could eat before class and so we could spend what little time we had together every night before he would have to leave at 9 o'clock for 4 hours. I would usually be sleeping by the time he got home. When Arnold returned home, I was nowhere to be found. Of course, he freaked out and filed a missing persons report after blowing up my phone and me not replying for over 30 minutes. It wasn't until 2 days later that Arnold ran into our neighbor while getting the mail, and for some reason, he thought that there was a possibility that he might know something. Arnold admitted that he didn't really think he did, but he was trying everything he could at first by asking anyone any kind of questions he could think of. He asked him when he saw me last and stuff like that. This is where things get much crazier. My boyfriend thought he was acting really weird, and way weirder than usual, so he called the cops on him. But since they didn't have any proof or probable cause, and they didn't have a warrant nor consent to search the house, it didn't go very far. Arnold had this very serious feeling inside that something was wrong with this guy and that he had something to do with me going missing. He literally snuck into our neighbor's house later that night after he saw him leave. The house was disgusting and was honestly as bad as some of the worst Hoarders episodes I've ever seen. He looked all around the house and was yelling for me in case I was in there. He had no clue if I really was, but I finally heard him yelling for me and I screamed as best as I could from downstairs with the duct tape covering my mouth. He didn't hear me yelling until he started to search downstairs for me. Yes, the man kidnapped me and did unspeakable things to me for days. Arnold got me out of there and we called the police. Of course, we lied a bit so Arnold didn't get charged with breaking and entering. We told police that Arnold heard me screaming down there and that he rushed in here to save me and that we called the police right away. We never had any issue with Arnold getting any charges, thankfully. I don't really like to talk about how he kidnapped me and how it all went down. It makes me too uncomfortable. I'll explain it briefly, though. While Arnold was gone that night and I was sleeping, the man broke in and managed to knock me out cold by beating me half to death and dragged me next door in the middle of the night without anyone noticing. This story is very real, and what happened to me is still something I live with and sticks with me to this very day. He used to stare at me like a creeper every day, and we always thought he was strange, but never did we think it would come to this. I'm pretty sure this is literally every woman's worst nightmare. I went to summer camp a few times when I was a Boy Scout. It was usually pretty fun, especially the parts of the day we got to spend doing whatever we wanted. Nobody was actually invested in earning new merit badges unless it was for something cool, like wakeboarding. All we really cared about was messing around in the woods and swimming in the springs to beat the heat. It was a nice time just to be away from home and our parents for a week. The only thing a Boy Scout was missing was a girl to gallivant with. In the beginning, I thought I would go to summer camp every year if I could. However, things took a turn when I was 13 years old. After this trip, I left my troop and never went camping again. It was on the 4th day of summer camp, right in the middle of everything as far as responsibilities were concerned. It was a light day for me and my friends, 4 of us in all. We ran around the main common area of the campgrounds, used our allowances to buy ourselves each a souvenir knife at the general store, drank some yoo-hoos, and threw some tomahawks with the weapons guy between his classes. Eventually, two of us decided that we were getting tired and sweaty and just wanted to sit around in our tents until dinner time. But my closer friend Enoch and I wanted to keep it going. There was a network of trails that snaked all around the various campsites. We'd already taken the trail to the springs, so Enoch and I wanted to do a little more exploration. There were just the two of us, so we both had canteens full of water and snacks in our pockets, along with knives and cordage, a map, a compass, and I had a small first aid kit. We thought we were prepared for whatever we would run into out there. We didn't plan on going far either, since we had to be back in a little under 3 hours for dinner. We set out from our troop's campsite with plenty of daylight left and made our way into a mosquito-infested area of woods. The canopy shaded us pretty well, and the air was humid and stifling. We wanted to see what it was like out there, but all we discovered was that the trees were a bit taller. It wasn't long before we started to make conversation over the sound of afternoon bugs, the sort of bonding you would expect to occur between two 13-year-olds in the woods. We talked about girls, mostly in the ones that we thought were ugly, so on and so forth. None of it was very tasteful, admittedly. We jokingly proposed that it was possible for us to go far enough that we would find our way into the Girl Scout section of the campgrounds, which did exist but was well separated from the Boy Scouts. Then, our surroundings started to change inexplicably. Suddenly, there was a breeze washing away the warm blanket of moist, motionless air and replacing it with cool, dry wind. Initially, this was a great relief to me and Enoch, who had been sweating profusely for hours, even in the shade. It also seemed to drive away all the mosquitoes and gnats, which was a welcome bonus. But just a few moments later, the woods quickly darkened, and the sky above us, between the branches of the canopy, went from vibrant blue to a pale gray. "Hey Enoch," I said, concerned, "I think it's about to rain." "No kidding," he agreed. "More like we're about to get caught up in a thunderstorm. Should we turn back?" I suggested. "No," Enoch replied with confidence, looking down at his compass. "The trail that we're on loops back to camp. Right now we're heading due north, which means we're right in the middle. We might as well just keep going." "Well, sure," I said. Enoch seemed to be pretty confident about his navigation skills, so I let him make the decision to press on. However, the threat of being soaked to the bone put a damper on the mood, and as such, there was a lull in the conversation. We hiked on, listening for oncoming thunder and waiting to feel the first raindrop land on our heads, except it never came. The darkness that descended on us only increased, but rain never fell. "Hey Enoch," I said again, even more concerned this time. "Will you check the time, man? I think we might have missed dinner." Enoch looked down at his watch. "No way, man. We've only been hiking for," and then, suddenly, Enoch went silent and stopped in his tracks. "What is it, man?" I asked. "My watch is dead," he said gravely. "How is that possible? I thought you replaced the battery before going to camp." Enoch silenced me and started looking all around. "You hear that?" he whispered. I listened but didn't hear anything. Actually, I heard so much of nothing that it struck fear into my heart. It was totally silent, not a sound in the woods all around us. It was an unnatural quiet, devoid of any cicadas or even flies. For a minute, I peered deeper and deeper into the woods with my ears and heard only silence. Until finally, I heard singing, angelic singing, but it was so soft and quiet that it was almost inaudible but unmistakably the voice of a beautiful woman. Just by the way Enoch looked at me in that moment, wide-eyed and grinning, I knew he heard it too. "Oh, it's the Girl Scouts," he exclaimed. Before I could even respond, he bolted into the woods to go after the sounds. "Wait, Enoch, stop," I started to go with him, but by the time I had taken 10 steps off the trail, I realized I couldn't see well enough to go any farther. It was like the sky had fallen, darkness, like the dead of midnight, had snuffed out the light of day in merely a moment. A deep sense of dread filled my body, telling me to turn back. I backtracked the 10 steps I had taken without even turning around until I felt the flatness of the trail beneath my shoe again. At this point, all I could hear was my own breathing and heartbeat, and the singing, whoever was in the woods, growing louder and drawing near. But something was wrong. The sound no longer came from a single direction. Somehow, it was circling all around me, closing in on me. It was too loud to bear, and I felt like it was putting physical pressure on my body. I tried to cover my ears, but it was just useless. It all became a single, piercing cry. Finally, I heard a scream, a boy's scream. It cut through the cacophony and returned my surroundings to total silence, except for the echo of someone's cry for help. "Enoch," I called into the woods. "Come back," there was no reply. A moment later, I heard a twig snap on the trail from the direction we'd just come from. I hoped to see Enoch, but I didn't. Instead, there was an inhumane figure at the nearest bend in the trail, the shape of a tall woman, but composed of no flesh or bone whatsoever, only ominous light. As I gazed upon whatever spirit this was, it suddenly raced toward me. What I did next was pure instinct. I abandoned Enoch and ran blindly down the trail as quickly as my body could take me. I didn't stop until I spilled out into the campsite again, collapsing to the ground. When I looked up, I saw that everything was different. The sun was shining, the woods were alive with birds and bugs, and all of my friends were coming to see what was wrong with me, why I was so upset and panicky. I couldn't speak a word for hours. When I could finally tell the scout masters what happened, they didn't believe me. They sent a search party for Enoch, but they couldn't find a single trace of him. Even the police were never able to locate him, he simply vanished. Suspicion eventually turned to me because the story I told was so unbelievable. So, to avoid being put in an asylum, I ended up changing my official statement to losing track of him when we both went to take a piss at separate trees. I turned my back for just a minute, and then he was gone. In my worry and panic, I thought I saw something that wasn't there. But it's all lies because I know what happened. When I was in middle school, I was desperate for friends. I tried to talk to anyone that would let me sit with them, but nobody ever seemed to like me enough to keep me around, or they would just be mean to me. That's why, when the two prettiest, most popular girls in school, Azure and Alita, invited me to a sleepover with them, I was thrilled. I had tried sitting with them at lunch a few times before, but they always told me to go away because they were busy talking about something that wasn't my business. Then, on the last day of school one year, they both came up to me while I was sitting by myself. They said they really wanted to hang out with me over the summer but didn't want other people to see us hanging out together while we were still in school. Even as a naive and lonely middle schooler, I knew that was a severely underhanded invite, but I accepted it with enthusiasm anyway. I would take what I could get, and they knew it. Of course, my mom was just glad I was finally starting to hang out with other kids, and she gladly gave me permission to go, especially when I said that Azure's mom offered to serve all three of us dinner. When I got there, it was about 8 p.m., and I was already dressed in my pajamas. Alita and Azure were still fully dressed. When I asked if we were still going to have dinner together, Azure said that they had just finished eating right before I got there. Then Alita said I didn't need to eat so much anyway. They were already putting me down, but I wanted to be friends with them so badly that I let them do it. After I said hi to Azure's mom, who was already wine drunk and ready for us to not be her problem anymore, we all went up to Azure's room upstairs. It was a Jack and Jill style bedroom with her own bathroom and another bedroom on the other side. I asked Azure who was in the other room, but she snapped at me and said it was her older sister and told me not to be so nosy. I apologized profusely, but they just told me to be quiet because my voice was annoying. Azure had a bunch of awesome stuff in her room, from Taylor Swift posters to expensive makeup and giant stuffed animals, things that my mom couldn't afford to get me. But as much as I wanted to ask her about it, I knew she wouldn't like that, so I just looked at the floor. We started to play Truth or Dare, which Alita and Azure used to mine all sorts of information about me, including who I had a crush on and how much money my parents made. I told them everything honestly, only for them to laugh in my face every time. Whenever I asked them to tell the truth about something, they made up a bunch of ridiculous stuff that I knew was a lie, but of course, I wasn't going to call them out on it. When I finally got sick and tired of having to spill all my beans, I told them to dare me to do something. As soon as I said that, Alita and Azure looked at each other with the most wicked smiles, like they had been waiting for me to say that the whole time. Then Azure dared me to go into the bathroom and play the Bloody Mary game. I didn't know what it was at the time, and when I admitted this, they both screamed in disbelief that I didn't know who Bloody Mary was. They explained it to me and said I had to do it or I would have to leave the sleepover. I wanted to stay, so I stepped inside the bathroom. Azure and Alita lit a candle in front of the mirror, then they turned off the lights and shut the door. You have to say it loud and clear, Azure teased me from the other side. If you don't, we'll know. I was shaking. I had no idea what would happen. Was this Bloody Mary someone that could really be summoned? Would she really kill me if she came? I didn't know, but the only thing that pushed me forward was the need to be accepted and the belief that things like ghosts didn't exist. I looked at myself in the mirror, took a deep breath, and said, "Bloody Mary," 3 times slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. I looked behind my reflection, and there was nothing, until I saw a woman crawling out of the bathtub behind me. I screamed and turned around, and I realized it was real. There was a real bloody woman sitting in the shower. Her skin was gray, like she was dead, and her clothes were torn up. But her eyes were open, and she was looking right at me. Slowly, the woman stepped out of the tub and started walking toward me. I was so petrified I couldn't move. I wanted to, but it was like my legs had turned to stone. With every step she took, she left a trail of blood. Soon, she was right in front of me. I screamed again, but she grabbed me by the throat and lifted me up to my tiptoes. She opened her mouth and revealed a gaping jaw full of blood and blackness, inching toward my neck like she was going to take a bite out of it. I couldn't maintain control of myself, so in that moment, I peed my pants. But then, at the last second, the door swung open and the lights turned on. "What's going on in here?" Azure asked. "Why are you screaming?" I could barely get a word out through my stuttering teeth, but I managed what I could. "Bloody Mary was here," I said. "She was right in front of me. I saw her, and it was real. She grabbed me and everything, and she tried to kill me." Alita and Azure said, almost in unison, "What?" They looked all around the bathroom, but of course, she was gone. "Stop acting crazy," said Alita. "You're just begging for attention." "Honestly, it's kind of embarrassing," Azure snickered and agreed. "Wait, did you pee yourself?" That's disgusting, Alita exclaimed. Oh my god, so yeah, actually, I think if you're going to act like that, you just have to leave. What? Why? I asked in disbelief. But before I knew it, Azure and Alita dragged me out of the bathroom and pushed me down the stairs, then threw all my stuff at me. I crawled to Azure's mother, a sobbing mess, and begged her to call my mom. Based on the look in her eyes and the way she sighed, I think she was very close to just letting me cry myself to sleep on the ground. But thankfully, she had the basic decency to call my mother so I could get out of that awful house. I never fully explained to my mother what happened, except for the fact that they were so mean that I cried. I hid the bruises from being pushed down the steps, and I wore turtlenecks for the next few weeks to hide the bruises on my neck. That was how my summer vacation began that year. Needless to say, I never left the house again until school was back in session. As for Bloody Mary, Azure and Alita's gaslighting was so effective on me that I honestly believed she existed for over 2 years after that. Until one day, I told this story to my first real friend in high school, and they explained to me the obvious truth that it was just Azure's older sister in a convincing costume. I'm 18 years old and going to be a freshman in college this September. This past July, my friend Zelda held a pool party in her backyard as a sort of graduation party, minus any of her family being around because her parents were away. She often has the house to herself, so her parents' house is the go-to spot for a lot of hangouts. She invited like 100 people from our grade. There had to be upwards of 150 people there at the night's peak. I was one of the first to show up with my friend Jonah because we're close with Zelda, so we wanted to help out a little bit. By the time people started showing up, everyone congregated slowly from the kitchen and living room to outside in the backyard by the pool. Some people brought their bathing suits and jumped into the pool, others just jumped in their underwear, and then, of course, most others just stood around the pool. She has a huge backyard at a certain point. So many people were at the party that it was clear as day people were bringing friends from other schools because we didn't know everyone there. Zelda was getting mad because she made it clear she didn't want randoms. In fact, unfamiliar people seemed to be just barging through the gate, not even accompanied by people from our school or grade. There wasn't much we could do, though. The party was already too crazy to easily control. Zelda did throw in our class group chat not to bring any more randoms or they'd be asked to leave. The problem seemed to slow down after that. At around 1 a.m., the police came to the house and had to shut down the party due to multiple complaints from neighbors, so the music was turned off, and 99% of the guests were asked to leave. Mostly everyone cleared out except a few close friends, including some of Zelda's girlfriends, Letitia and I, and a few other guy friends. We helped do some cleaning, like picking up all the empty cans and bottles. Eventually, it was just 4 of us left there. I'm talking at like 3 a.m., if not later. Since it was hot outside, we migrated to the inside of the house in the air conditioning, where we were just chilling in the living room, continuing to drink. Then we all heard a distinct crack from upstairs, and we went silent. Zelda was the first to ask what was that as we all looked at each other with these wide-eyed, half-laughing, half-freaked-out faces. Letitia and I left, teasing Zelda that someone was upstairs in her room, and she begged us to stop and check it out, so we did. We went upstairs to Zelda's room. It was clear. We then went to the guest room that used to be her older brother's room, and we found one of our friends, Eudora, passed out in the bed. We went downstairs to tell her that Eudora was upstairs and knocked out. I guess that gave her a sigh of relief. Looking back, that didn't much explain a sound coming from upstairs if he was knocked out in bed, though. but we weren't exactly the most coherent at that moment. Eventually, Zelda and her friend Mia went to sleep in her room, Letitia fell asleep on the couch, and I went to her parents' bed. None of us were okay to drive anywhere. I can't remember how much time passed before I remember one of the girls screaming in the next room over, and then both of them. It was a heart-dropping kind of moment, but I didn't know if they were messing around with each other at first or not, but I realized pretty quickly the screams were way too real. I burst out of the bed and went to Zelda's room and opened the door. The lights were out. I could barely see anything except for the two girls huddled up, hugging each other in the corner of the room, basically curled up on the floor. I saw what they were screaming at. There was a tall person in the opposite corner of the room, on the other side of the bed from them. I saw him looking at me in the doorway. I yelled at the girls to run, and they did. There was so much yelling that even Eudora woke up and came out as the girls ran downstairs, screaming that the man was touching their feet. We followed, but looking back with three guys there, we regrettably didn't try to overpower that one man. We all left the house, and one of us called the police, waiting by the neighbor's house with the neighbors, possibly the same ones who called the cops on the party. We didn't see the man leave the front door ever, and after police searched the house and couldn't find him, that meant he left through the back door. None of us recognized who that man was. It was probably an older man who knew Zelda somehow that snuck into the house during the commotion of the party and thought Zelda would be alone after the party. It's some sick, scary stuff. Whether we could have overpowered him or not, we'll never know because we don't know if he was armed. There's a nice quiet scenic creek not far from my house. I like to drive my kayak up to it every once in a while on the weekends in the summer. This one particular weekend was one of those weekends. The weather was perfect, sunny and 70s. I'd kayaked down this creek a bunch of times and never had I seen anyone else kayaking it. That's part of the reason I like it because I'm a very reserved person and I like to do things myself, preferably with privacy. So, I set out on the kayak not far from where I parked my car, which is in a gravelly dirt parking area right off the road. There was one other car that pulled in a few minutes after I did, which was unusual. I'd never seen any other cars except my own here. 20 minutes into my kayaking, someone came out from the woods ahead of me, coming up on the left, and approached the edge of the water. He stopped and waved at me and smiled. He put his hands on his hips and greeted me. It seemed he had an expectation for me to stop and chat. I instantly knew I didn't like his smile, but my mother raised me to be polite to everybody, so I stopped paddling and smiled and greeted him back. There was an awkward pause where he was just nodding his head with his closed-lip smile, and I had to break the silence by saying, "It's a beautiful day out." He nodded his head and said, "Yup," then asked where I'm from. I made something up and said, "From up north, just visiting." He clearly lacked the ability to hold any sort of conversation, and that's coming from me. I'm not the most social person myself. So, I wanted to just move along. I told him to have a great rest of his day and continued onward down the river. Never in a million years was I expecting what happened next to happen. I turned when I heard a snap of a stick or something from not far behind me. There, in the not-so-far distance, was the guy hiding behind a couple of trees, seemingly following me. I was disturbed and uncomfortable, like he was clearly trying to not be seen. I was scared to call him out in fear of how he might respond, so I pretended not to notice him and continued to kayak down. I would continue to side glance every so often to see if he was still following me, and he was. I had never wanted to see someone else in the water so much in my life. I took out my phone to try to call my dad or my brother for help, but of course, I had no cell reception out there. Still, instead of being followed and probably attacked, I decided to stop in my place, turn around, and threaten to call the police if he didn't stop following me. The man just stood in place behind another big tree, though he was clear as day there. I then decided to fake call the cops. I raised my phone in the air at the man and said, "I see you there, I'm calling them now." I then proceeded to fake a phone call, pretending like I'm talking to the police. The man started to walk away deeper into the woods. It seemed to have worked. I turned around immediately and started kayaking back up the way I came as fast as I possibly could. I would constantly look over my shoulders until I got back to where I launched the kayak. I made it safely. I checked my whole surroundings before stepping out of the water and carrying my kayak back to my car. The other car in the little parking area was still there, but I made a disturbing discovery that may have saved my life. Up until this point, everything that happened could have maybe been explained away. However, I noticed broken glass near the back of my car and the back passenger side window wasn't there anymore. It had been shattered. I didn't step 1 foot closer to my car. I stayed hidden in the woods and checked if I had bars now that I was closer to the road. I did, and I called 911 successfully. I reported the whole incident and the broken window, and I stated I was scared I was still being followed. Waiting for the police to arrive felt like the longest, most tense moment of my life. It dragged on far too long, but when they pulled into the dirt area, I finally came out from the woods and waved at them. I pointed to the car, and 2 police officers came out and approached the car, where they found him, the man from the woods, waiting in the back seat of my car, hiding and waiting for me to enter my car to grab me. It was beyond satisfying to see him arrested. He definitely wasn't smiling anymore. I looked at him as it almost seemed like he was avoiding looking at me as he was taken to the police car. I'm happy the man was so stupid that he thought I wouldn't notice shattered glass all over the side of my car. What you're about to hear is something that will sound like it was straight from a horror movie, but it's absolutely true. Every summer, my friends and I go on a camping trip to a new location. It's a tradition we've had for years. One year, we chose a hiking trail in West Glacier, Montana. My friend Enda is a photographer, so he always likes to bring his camera equipment and get lots of nature shots. Our first day there, the 3 of us did a lot of hiking and exploring, taking in the sights and allowing Enda to get a lot of shots. That first night there, nothing was out of the ordinary. We had 2 tents. I was alone in mine while the other 2 shared theirs. The next day, we did some fishing at a nearby river and a few other things that aren't really that interesting to talk about, but that second night was where things got weird. The fire had just been put out, and we went to our respective tents. None of us had even fallen asleep yet when we started hearing sounds from out in the woods. It was very clearly a person's voice. It sounded like an older woman's voice. It kept getting louder and more clear every 10 seconds or so. I called over to my friend's tent right next to mine, asking if they heard that, and they called back saying yes, someone was out there. The voice got so close and so clear that we could hear her saying, "Hello." I was shaking in my socks. Maybe you might think we're bad people for not jumping to help an older woman who may have been stranded in the woods, but that just didn't seem right. Being in the middle of the woods at night hearing someone calling out, "Hello," is beyond terrifying. I heard footsteps approach the tent, then stop. The voice once again said, "Hello," but it was right outside the tent this time, and now that it was this close, it didn't sound like a woman anymore. It sounded like a man trying to sound like a woman, raising the pitch in his voice. The person outside my tent suddenly started shaking the tent aggressively, and I freaked out and screamed, "What do you want?" My friend shouted to go away to the person. The shaking then stopped as suddenly as it started, and I heard the footsteps quickly hurry away. I waited a few moments before unzipping my tent and grabbing my sleeping bag to go to my friend's tent. Even those brief 5 seconds outside the tent, I felt like I was going to be grabbed at any moment. I felt safer as I was in the tent with them and not alone anymore. None of us knew what to think, but we all three agreed it didn't sound like an actual woman. It sounded like some creepy man pretending to be one to get us to let our guards down. The question was why, though. Was he carrying a weapon? Either way, we didn't think it was safe to get up and leave now. We agreed to leave first thing in the morning, as soon as the sun would begin to rise. We also agreed that someone would need to stay awake at all times to keep watch, so we agreed to take turns sleeping. My friend Gabriel took the first shift while Enda and I tried to sleep, which was hard to do after what just happened, especially when we'd keep thinking we were hearing footsteps surrounding the tent. Eventually, though, after many tense hours, I managed to fall asleep out of pure exhaustion. I never woke up until morning time because, apparently, Enda fell asleep on his shift, and we were all asleep by that point. We were happy the sun was up, so we packed our stuff and headed back to the truck. It was a long ride home, and during the drive, Enda was going through his camera, looking at the shots that he got over the course of the 2 days there. The last 3 pictures, however, were not pictures that he took. There were 2 pictures taken of our campsite while it was still dark out. The 3rd picture was taken inside of our tent with all 3 of us asleep. Nothing was missing or stolen, strangely enough, and none of us were attacked in any way. Yet it remains the most up thing that has ever happened to any of us. Some random creep out in the woods stalking our tent and waiting for the right moment to enter our campsite, go through our stuff, sneak into our tent, and take a picture of all 3 of us, probably just to freak us out. And whoever it was, they accomplished their goal for sure. Summer is the greatest season by a long shot. That's a hill I'll die on any day. My love for the summer doesn't revolve around partying or drinking, as you may expect, but nature, warmer weather, and the outdoors are inseparable in my opinion. And I guarantee you that when the heat rolls through, I spend more hours outside than inside. It was a warm night in mid-June a few summers ago when this happened. I was 16 or 17 at the time. For context, there's a massive nature preserve near my house. When I say massive, I mean it. It's close to 1,000 acres in size. To this day, there are still parts of it that I'm positive I haven't explored. 2 of my friends and I agreed to spend a night camping in those woods. Technically, camping there was strictly forbidden and borderline illegal, but we figured that there was no chance someone would catch us in this dense forest. We just had to trek as deeply as possible. Zane was the camping fanatic of the group. I'm telling you, this kid loved cosplaying as a Boy Scout and probably knew close to 100 different knots. Our other friend Clement always supplied the drinks. If we were sober, he was unhappy. That's just how things went when Clement was involved. I remember the feeling of the gentle summer breeze blowing through my hair as the 3 of us packed up Clement's car. The weather was ideal, not too cold, not too hot. A few beers later, the 3 of us found ourselves lugging camping equipment through the woods at like 11:40. I can't lie, I was feeling the alcohol start to hit me as we marched along. Zane always carried this industrial-grade flashlight with him, so the darkness of the forest wasn't much of an issue. As much as I enjoyed the outdoors, though, traversing through thick woods at this hour was a bit creepy, even with Zane's flashlight on hand. After close to half an hour of straight walking, the three of us found ourselves in a small flat clearing that was an ideal spot to set up camp. We pitched our tent as per Zane's instruction and set our chairs up. The fire was the next step. Zane once again took the lead on this, and after a few more minutes, we had a pretty decent fire going. Clement reached into his bag and tossed me another drink. He then grabbed his JBL speaker and started playing some music. The vibe was perfect, and we must have been talking and drinking for a good 2 hours. We were all pretty drunk at that point, and I could tell the other guys were just about ready to pack it up for the night. Clement turned the music down and started collecting discarded beer cans. Just then, a deafening whistle pierced the silence. I nearly jumped out of my seat, going from drunken haze to high alert in a matter of seconds. I don't know how to describe it. The whistle was abnormally loud but still sounded distant. Clement quickly shut the speaker off, and the three of us sat in silence as we exchanged concerned looks. I could feel my heartbeat pounding through my chest. We sat there frozen in place for what seemed like forever, listening intently to our surroundings, but there was nothing. It almost seemed quieter now than it had when we first got there, like eerily quiet. Not even the normal wood sounds you come to anticipate. I used that time to replay my memory of the whistle back in my head. It definitely wasn't an animal's noise. The best way I can describe it is a standard whistle you would hear at a ballpark. Zane finally broke the silence, quietly urging us to pack up and leave. Clement and I disagreed with that plan, though. We might risk encountering whoever made the noise, which I was beyond terrified of. It was past 3 a.m. at this point, and an encounter this late would only mean trouble. Zane hypothesized that whoever made that noise was probably aware of our presence, which was a chilling thought. I didn't know what to do. On one hand, staying put violated every survival instinct I had. Packing up and leaving at this hour didn't seem like a much better option either, though. We finally agreed to wait it out. I went to put the fire out, but Zane cautioned me against it, saying that a fire would repel any dangerous animals. Only then did the true gravity of the situation smack me in the face. We were literally miles away from any civilization. It was 3 a.m., and there was an unknown entity somewhere in the darkness. Another 10 minutes or so passed, and we had resumed talking, but at a much lower volume and with no music. I don't think any of us felt safe going to sleep just yet. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Something small flew over the darkness of Clement's shoulder and landed directly in the fire. It was a firecracker. I screamed bloody murder as it started sparkling in the fire, and Zane cursed as he sprung up out of his chair and bolted into the darkness. Clement and I scrambled to follow, leaving all of our stuff behind. We caught up with Zane, whose flashlight was beaming wildly through the woods as he frantically sprinted. We ran until we couldn't anymore, and Clement keeled over and threw up. Zane shut the light off, and the three of us stood there panting, trying to figure out if we were being followed. To my surprise, it didn't seem like anyone followed us. I don't think I've ever been so afraid. Why in the world would someone have done that? We needed to figure out what to do. Clement wanted to just find our way out of the woods and never come back, but Zane was reluctant to leave all of his camping gear behind. Plus, he reminded us the fire was still active. I was dumbfounded. How could he be concerned with forest fires after what had just happened? Eventually, I agreed with Zane that we should at least check on the site. After all, no one had actually chased us, so there was a slight possibility that whoever threw that firecracker was just playing a cruel prank. Zane was a navigational expert and was actually able to retrace our footsteps. I could make out the glow of the fire as we quietly approached. Before I could get any closer, though, Clement put a hand in front of me and pointed with a horrified look on his face. I strained my eyes to make out the sight in the distance. What I saw is probably the most terrifying thing I'd ever laid eyes on. There were 3 people sitting motionlessly in our chairs like statues. The one whose face I could see looked lifeless, and his mouth was open. I was afraid to move. What were they even doing? I thought, realizing that they weren't even talking. This was not normal. The 3 of us watched for a little while longer before deciding to back off. We turned to leave, but Clement's foot clipped a rock, causing him to curse in frustration. Within seconds, the glow from the fire abruptly went dark, as if it had been covered with a cloak. It was freakishly fast. We didn't stick around another second. We again sprinted away from the site, but this time we could hear footsteps crashing behind us. We didn't stop this time. We bolted out of the woods and ran all the way to Clement's car. By some miracle, we weren't followed out of the woods. None of us spoke on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts. The next day, Zane insisted we return to the site in the daylight to collect his belongings. Clement wanted nothing to do with that, but I agreed to accompany Zane. After some searching, we eventually found the site, which looked mostly untouched. That is, until we got a little closer and noticed the putrid smell coming from Zane's tent. He unzipped it, and we found a dead, rotting rat. It was sickening. I took the hint and haven't been back to that preserve since. This ongoing issue started about a month ago, but let me provide some context first. I'm 25 years old and I live with my parents. My family is not well off and never has been, and pretty much all the money I make goes into supporting the household. My relationship with my parents is not the best. We bicker quite often, and whenever I'm not working or hanging with friends, I tend to stick to myself. I don't want to write a hard luck story or anything like that, but I've had a tough time growing up. Fitness has always been my go-to escape. I see it as a healthy way to get my mind off personal burdens while also providing a good excuse to leave the house. There's a park about a 20-minute drive from my house that has a workout facility with bars for pull-ups, dips, and other calisthenic exercises. During the summer months, I like to go there to work out, as nature helps calm my mind. I like to go at nighttime because, since it's a public park, it tends to get busy during the day. So, one night while my parents were arguing, I decided to slip out of the house to go work out. It was an extremely hot summer night, probably 85 degrees. I remember breathing in the humid air as I walked from my doorstep to the beat-up white Corolla sitting in our driveway. I started the rickety engine and rolled down the windows as the warm summer breeze flowed through my hair. I arrived at the park and exited my car. I was the only car in the lot. It was probably 10 or 11 p.m. The park was completely empty at this time. The beautiful scenery mixed with the steamy air to create a soothing atmosphere, which is another reason why I like this park so much. It sits on top of a hill that overlooks the downtown area of my city, which always adds pleasant and sentimental emotions to my evenings. Anyway, I started a set on the pull-up bar. I wasn't really counting the repetitions. When I work out, I just do it till failure, then take a break and do it a couple more times. It was somewhere between my sets when I took a break to loosen up my arms. Before I got back on the bar, though, an indescribable feeling came over me, and a subconscious urge forced me to turn my head around. Standing literally a foot away from my face was a tall, beaten-looking man. I actually screamed and jumped like 5 feet back. He let out a raunchy, boisterous laugh and apologized, saying he didn't mean to scare me. His appearance and mannerisms were extremely eccentric right off the bat, like he was damn near face to face with me. He clearly had something wrong with him. I asked him why he was so close to me, and he said he lives here. He explained that he sees me working out here all the time and asked me if I could teach him. Now, I'm a very non-confrontational type of person, and especially during a time like that, I really just wanted to be left alone. I awkwardly but politely told him I was just going to do some pull-ups and leave. I hopped back on the bar and continued my set. His words marinated in my mind. He sees me here all the time. I felt the gaze of his eyes burning the back of my neck, but like I said, I'm very non-confrontational. While he did make me increasingly uneasy, I didn't really know what to say or do about it. But then something really weird happened. Right as I was about to finish my set, I heard him mutter my full name. My blood instantly turned cold as I jumped off the bar and slowly backed away. I said a shaky, "What?" He didn't respond and instead just stared at me with this crazed, wide-eyed smile. I thought I might have been hearing things, that's how bizarre it was. I started to get an awful feeling in my gut, like something bad was about to happen. Without another word, I decided to quickly walk back to my car and leave. I felt that man staring at me while I retreated, and thankfully he didn't follow me. Before I left the park, though, I took one last look and saw him hanging from the bar, attempting to do a pull-up. I watched as he grabbed the bar, tried to pull himself up, and then failed and tried again in the exact position I was previously in. I swiftly left the park without looking back. The entire ride back, I questioned myself. Did he really say my name? Was I hallucinating? I tried to forget about it, and eventually, I did. I woke up early the next day to get to work. I work construction and have to wake up very early before my parents, so I was the first one to notice the unmarked envelope sitting at my front door. It was addressed to me. I picked it up and figured I'd read whatever was inside whenever I had the chance. It was another sweltering hot summer day, and I took my lunch break early to cool down. I sat in my car while eating my pre-made sandwich and decided to open the envelope. I didn't really know what to expect, but never in a million years did I think I'd find 10 printed photos of me. They were all unknowingly taken. One was of me in my car, one was of me at work, one was of me exercising at the park. I instantly remembered that creepy man from the night before and started to feel uncontrollably nauseous. I stared in disbelief as I flipped through the rest of them. One was of my house, and the worst of all was a photo of me sleeping, taken from outside my window. I nearly choked on my food as tears rolled down my cheeks. I felt unsafe. I told my boss a serious issue popped up, and I left work right away. He wasn't happy with me, but I didn't care. I took a picture of the photos and drove directly to the police station. I gave the police the photos and explained my encounter at the park. I described the man to them, and they said they would look into it. I told my parents about it too, and for the first time in a long time, I actually got some sympathy out of them. More things started happening, though. A couple of nights later, at like 3 a.m., I awoke to knocks at the door. I didn't open it, assuming the worst. One day, I found a sticky note pasted to my car window with a heart drawn in Sharpie. I went back to the police to report this, and they said they would open up a stalker investigation. I haven't heard back from them yet. I figured it's hard to build a case without having concrete evidence. This happened about a month ago, and I've been on high alert ever since. My parents are looking for a new home, which is already tough given our financial situation. I'll update if anything further happens, but until then, I'll continue to sleep with one eye open. This happened to me last summer when I was 23. I wasn't a very outgoing kid at the time. If I ever did anything social, it was because my degenerate friends had somehow dragged me out of the house. This was one of those times, well, it was supposed to be. My friend Ralph invited me to a house party at like 8 p.m. It was pretty spontaneous, but I had nothing going on, so I reluctantly agreed to go with him. I knew he was going to give me crap if I refused. I can't even lie, though, the idea of a party, even with strangers, sounded more appealing than being alone. Ralph was a few towns over from me, so it made more sense for us to drive separately instead of going together. He gave me the address, and I was on my way. The literal second I pulled onto the street, Ralph bailed at the last minute. Rightfully so, I was super frustrated. How could he bail on me like this? There I was, feeling like a complete idiot outside a stranger's house. Annoyed but determined not to waste the night, I decided to go in. I drove all the way here, I thought. Might as well go inside. I walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. The host, Crispin, greeted me warmly. He was instantly likable, charismatic, and friendly without being a douchebag. He introduced me around, and things were actually less awkward than I had anticipated. People were really friendly to me despite not knowing who I was. There were even a few girls I had my eyes on. I decided to enjoy the party and hit the booze hard. It was getting pretty late, but the party was still raging. Admittedly, I might have overdone it with the drinking. At one point, I was so nauseous and dizzy that I needed a break. It must have been close to 3 a.m. at that point. I went upstairs to look for a bathroom, but they were all occupied. The house was deceptively big. Granted, it was probably the alcohol, but I was literally getting lost stumbling through the maze of hallways up there. After making it to the top floor, I found a door leading to what seemed like an attic or storage room. Desperate for privacy, I figured it was as good a place as any to pull myself together. I groped around blindly for the light switch, but there was none. This was definitely an attic or something, as there was also dust everywhere. There was a window in the far corner, which I opened, allowing the cool night breeze to wash over me. There was a solid minute there where I was seriously considering throwing up onto the roof. The breeze somewhat cured my nausea, though, so I just kept my head hung out of the window. It was dark outside, and the quiet was a refreshing contrast to the boisterous chaos downstairs. Sometimes all you need to restore your state of mind is a gentle breeze and some peace and quiet. Just as I was about to close the window and head back, I heard a faint noise, footsteps on the roof shingles. That didn't make any sense, though. Was I going crazy? Curious, I climbed out onto the roof. In all honesty, there was probably a 0% chance I would have done that if I had been sober. I slowly stood up and looked around. In the moonlight, I saw something terrifying. There were two masked figures with bags emerging from another window. It dawned on me, Crispin's house was being robbed. I started panicking. Should I shout? Confront them? Then a more pressing question hit me. What if they were armed? In my clumsy state of disbelief, I slipped and scuffed one of the shingles pretty loudly. One of the burglars heard it and jolted his head in my direction. Our eyes briefly met, and I froze. He nudged his partner, and the two of them quickly started making their way across the roof. Adrenaline surged through me. I couldn't let them get away. Crispin had been so welcoming, and I felt a surge of loyalty. I decided to act. I quietly followed the burglars across the roof, keeping a safe distance. They headed towards a sloping part of the roof for an easier escape. As they climbed down, I pulled out my phone to dial 911 but fumbled in my drunken state, dropping it. The phone clattered loudly, and the burglar turned sharply. "Who's there?" one of them hissed. Heart pounding, I ducked and scanned my surroundings, spotting a loose roof shingle. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it towards them. It missed, but the noise startled them, causing one to lose his footing. He tumbled down the roof, crashing into the gutter before falling to the ground. The other burglar, now panicked, leaped to a neighboring tree and scrambled down. I rushed to the edge of the roof and saw the fallen burglar groaning on the ground. I needed to alert everyone. As I turned to head back, I heard sirens. Someone else must have called the cops. I stumbled back into the attic room and made my way downstairs, trying to appear calm. The party was still in full swing, oblivious to the drama outside. I found Crispin laughing and chatting with guests. "Crispin, you need to call the police. There's been a robbery." "I saw the burglar on the roof," I said. Crispin's face turned from amusement to shock. "Are you serious?" he said as he hurried to make the call. I explained what happened. The party mood shifted from celebration to concern. Apparently, one of Crispin's neighbors had coincidentally already called the police to file a noise complaint, which was an incredibly ironic turn of good fortune. When they arrived, I recounted my story, leading them to the injured burglar. The man was arrested, but his partner had fled. The party ended abruptly. People started scattering, and the lights got flipped on. I tried my best to act sober, but even after all that happened, I was still stumbling a bit. Crispin thanked me profusely, still in disbelief. As for me, I was just glad I could help despite the bizarre and terrifying circumstances. Looking back, I still can't really explain why the burglars would have chosen a house having a party to rob, but maybe they had prior knowledge of the house and knew no one would be upstairs. I figured that would be the end of the story, but fast forward a few months, and I've got quite the update. I was playing video games at Ralph's house one night when he got a call from Crispin, who invited us over for a few beers. Up until that point, I hadn't actually realized the two of them were that close. The first thing I noticed when I pulled up to Crispin's house was that the front door and every window in sight were completely different. Was I not remembering his house right? I could have sworn the windows and the front door had been white, but they were all gray and much more heavy-duty looking. Crispin waved us in, and we went down to his basement. We cracked a few beers and started playing a game of pool. To my surprise, he actually recognized me from the party and thanked me again for my trouble. What he told us was actually crazy, though. Apparently, the burglar the police caught that night refused to snitch on his partner and was currently serving a lengthy prison sentence. The police hadn't been able to get any leads into catching the other guy, though. Crispin told us that not even a week after the incident, his family started receiving threatening letters from an unknown sender, some of which included pictures of Crispin and his family members. Obviously, they reported these occurrences, but the police had no real leads. A month after that, Crispin's mom noticed a suspicious vehicle circling the house at around 1 a.m., and a few days later, Crispin's dad claimed that things in their backyard had been gone through and moved around. In response, Crispin's dad increased their home security and even went as far as to replace and reinforce all their doors and windows. I was shocked. This was still an ongoing issue for Crispin, and I had no idea how serious a situation like this could get. Summer's fast approaching, and I'm sure I'll have another update when I see Crispin again. As a child growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the local playground was a place of joy and laughter, a haven where my friends and I could escape the world's worries. But one summer day, that all changed. It started out like any other day, with sun shining brightly overhead and the sound of children's laughter filling the air. But as we played on the swings and climbed the jungle gym, a sense of unease began to settle over us. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of our vision. But as the afternoon wore on, the feeling grew stronger, until it felt as though we were being stalked by some unseen presence. As we ventured deeper into the playground, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. And then, as we reached the old abandoned slide at the far end of the playground, we saw it, a figure, dark and shadowy, lurking among the rusted metal. With a cry of terror, we turned and fled from the playground, our hearts pounding in our chests as we raced home. But even as we reached the safety of our house, we could still feel the eyes of the creature watching us from the darkness, its malevolent presence lingering in the air like a foul stench. In the days that followed, the playground became a place of dread, its once cheerful atmosphere replaced by an aura of fear and mistrust. And though we never spoke of what we had seen that day, the memory of the haunted playground would stay with us forever, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the borders of our reality. As a child, I always found attics to be mysterious places, filled with forgotten treasures and hidden secrets. But what I discovered in the attic of my childhood home would forever change my perception of those dusty, cobweb-covered spaces. It all started on a lazy summer afternoon, when my parents decided it was time to clean out the attic and rid of the clutter that had accumulated over the years. As we climbed the creaky stairs and pushed open the heavy attic door, a wave of nostalgia washed over me, mingled with a sense of trepidation at what we might find hidden in the shadows. The attic was a labyrinth of old boxes and forgotten relics, with dusty furniture and forgotten memories scattered among the cobwebs. As we began to sift through the detritus of years gone by, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that some unseen presence lurked just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And then, as I reached the far corner of the attic, I saw it, a small, nondescript box tucked away behind a pile of old blankets. Curiosity getting the better of me, I reached out and opened the box, revealing its contents to the dim light of the attic. Inside were photographs old and yellowed with age, depicting scenes from another time. But as I looked closer, I realized that these were no ordinary photographs. They were images of my family, taken long before I was born, in a house that looked eerily similar to the one we were currently in. As I flipped through the photographs, a sense of unease settled over me, as if I was peering into a past that had been intentionally forgotten. And then, as I reached the bottom of the box, I found a photograph that sent a chill down my spine, a picture of a young boy standing in front of the same attic door, his eyes wide with fear. It was then that I realized the truth. The attic was haunted by the spirits of those who had come before, trapped in a liminal space between the past and the present. As I looked around at the dusty relics of a bygone era, I knew that I would never be able to forget the horrors that lurked within the forgotten attic of my childhood home. This happened when I was a young child, maybe around 7 years old. My parents had me late. My two older siblings are both at least 10 years older than me. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a commotion downstairs. It was my parents. I cracked my door open and heard them freaking out about something, though I wasn't sure what it was. I went to the stairway and stood at the top, calling down, "Mom, Dad." My mom came to the bottom of the stairs and said to me, "Go back to bed." I listened without asking any questions. I could tell they were stressed about something, though. I tried to go back to sleep when I heard the front door downstairs slam shut, followed by dead silence. I presumed they had left the house, but wasn't sure why. Either way, I listened to my mom and went back to sleep. I woke up again to sounds downstairs. It was the sound of the front door closing and then footsteps, but no talking. Naturally, I assumed they were back home and just being quiet so they wouldn't wake me up. I heard occasional steps and thuds from downstairs, drawers and cabinets being opened and closed, and I thought for sure I heard the fridge opening too. I thought it was my older brother Jethro. He's 10 years older than me and was already driving at the time, so him getting home late and rummaging through the fridge wasn't abnormal at all. These are all things I was telling myself, logical explanations for what I was hearing. Eventually, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, getting louder and closer until they reached the top and made their way to my door. My door quietly and slowly opened. I didn't sit up or move, I just had my eyes open, facing the door as I was still lying down. There weren't any lights on outside of my room, so whoever was walking around was doing so in the dark. All I saw was a black mass at my doorway, resembling the shape of someone's head. I said every name, starting from Jethro to Mom to Dad, then I just asked, "Who's there?" They didn't reply, they just closed the door. I was left there, confused but mildly creeped out. I heard footsteps going downstairs. I was convinced it was my dad, now just coming to check on me after getting home, though I wasn't sure why he was ignoring me. I didn't hear anything from downstairs for a while. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went downstairs in the dark. I kept all the lights off as I approached the kitchen and froze at the doorway, noticing a tall figure standing right in the middle of the kitchen. I said, "Dad," assuming it was him based on the size of the person. A deep voice said, "Go back upstairs." I ran back up the stairs to my room, closed the door, and jumped under the covers. All I was thinking was why my dad's voice sounded like that. The reality of a stranger being in the house didn't dawn on my innocent little mind until a little later when I heard the front door opening and a commotion from downstairs again, voices of my parents. I went to the top of the stairway again and was shocked to see I was still awake. I asked what happened, and they told me that Jethro had a little accident but was going to be fine. I found out a month later that he had gotten into a car accident, driving in conditions he shouldn't have been driving in. My parents had gotten a call from the hospital and rushed to see him first thing, leaving me to sleep. I asked my dad if he had come in my room before, and that was when I learned that they had been gone for hours. My mom started freaking out, yelling at my dad because he had neglected to lock the door when they rushed out of the house. Me telling my parents about the person at my bedroom door and in the kitchen caused my dad to search the house with his gun and my mom to call the police. The last thing I remember was being asked by a police officer to give my story. My parents tell me they felt like morons having to explain to the cops that they left me alone and left the door unlocked. I don't think anything of value was stolen, even though whoever broke into the house clearly didn't have intentions of harming me. Having a complete stranger in your house is already a terrifying ordeal. Now imagine going through that at 7 years old. It was around 2012 to 2013. My brother was about 6 or 7 at the time, and we had just moved into a new house to be closer to school and for cheaper rent. It was a pretty nice house, all things considered. It even had a cozy fireplace for the winter. Anyway, my brother was really into Batman and had this Batman car that, if a button was pressed, made noises and lit up. It was basically his favorite toy, so he played with it often. Then one afternoon, he came inside from playing out back and told us he found something. Naturally, my mom and I asked what it was. It was a picture of a young boy, in the form of one of those tags you get if your parents paid extra for school photos. The picture was dirty and full of wear and tear, even to the point you couldn't see the year it was taken. We thought, okay, some parent lost their kid's picture, no big deal. Then my brother said something that confused me. "That's Magnus," he said. I looked at him with a facial expression that basically asked him to repeat himself. He did. He pointed at the picture and said, "This is Magnus. He's my friend." I slowly nodded my head as if I knew who he was talking about. The main reason this confused me is because my brother didn't make friends easily, and he had no friends that I knew of. This Magnus only came up once we had moved. I shrugged it off and figured he'd made friends with the next-door neighbors or something, and he somehow got the school picture as a keepsake. That night, around 2 a.m., when everyone in the house was asleep, I woke up to my brother talking. Naturally, annoyed, I walked into his room to tell him to go to bed or else he'd wake up our parents. It was weird because when I walked into his room, he was sitting up straight in his bed as if he was actually talking to someone and not just to himself or his toys. I told him to go to bed and went to bed myself. A couple of days later, my mom was talking to me about my brother and asked if I'd seen him get up at night. I said no, I'd woken up to him talking a few nights ago, but that was it. Why? She said he had been acting weird, but as usual, we both shrugged it off as him being a kid. Now, in my room, my bed was right across from my door. This meant if I turned over, I could see into the hallway right in front of me. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom, and since I was, and still am, very afraid of the dark, I left the hallway light on, knowing my dad would turn it off once he got up. I'd probably be asleep by then. I was lying in my bed, facing my door, when a sudden noise made me jump. It was my brother's damn Batman car making noises. I got up to tell my brother that he shouldn't be up this late playing. But when I got into his room, he was asleep in his bed, with the toy across the room on the floor still making noise. I walked over to it to turn it off and was finally able to go back to sleep. However, the following days, my brother wouldn't stop talking about Magnus. It was honestly starting to freak me out, so I went over to the neighbors' houses to the right and left of us. One house didn't even have kids, and the other was vacant. This started to worry me, but my dad said it was probably just an imaginary friend he came up with. I went along with it since I couldn't think of any other explanation. Almost every night, one of us, my mom, dad, or sister would say we heard my brother's toy making noise and had to go into the room to turn it off. I explained that I had to do it as well and once again brought up my brother talking to someone. One night, my dad swore up and down that the toy was probably motion activated. But when we bought it, there was no advertisement for motion activation. My sister and I were so unnerved by it that we started to sleep in my room together. I'm glad we did, otherwise, I'd probably write this off as a bad dream. My sister and I were talking, trying to keep each other calm and in good spirits, until we heard the dreaded noise of my brother's toy. We both looked toward my open door and into my brother's room, which was right across from mine. Our expressions turned to horror as we saw my brother's toy rolling past the door all on its own. We screamed and ran to our parents' room. They got mad at our brother, saying it was a cruel joke to play on us as we were already freaked out. What he said sent chills down my spine. It wasn't me. Magnus wanted to play. That night, the toy went into the trash, batteries taken out and all. My sister and I were relieved until the next day when my brother had the toy again. My parents accused him of getting it out of the trash, to which he responded, "Magnus got it for me." The toy was broken into small pieces and thrown away for the final time. My brother was obviously upset, but our parents got him a new Batman figurine, and everything was fine. It wasn't until about a week later, when we all felt that everything was okay now and that Magnus was gone, that something happened. My mom was cooking chicken breasts on the countertop with the George Foreman grill. She had come into the living room to ask us something, and then we all jumped as we heard a crash in the kitchen. We went in there to see the George Foreman grill halfway across the kitchen, as if it had been thrown. My mom swore it was nowhere near the edge, and my dad had no explanations. Nothing happened afterward, and we moved out about a year later. But to this day, I wonder if my brother's imaginary friend Magnus wasn't imaginary. When I was just 9, we moved to a new house in a different town. I was entering a new elementary school as a 5th grader, which is always tough starting out. It was a bit awkward, as all the kids already knew each other, and I was just some random kid entering the scene. In my elementary school, you were made to sit with the kids from your class during lunch. I remember it being really awkward the first few days. Kids are extremely judgmental around that age, and I was judged as the new kid, making it more difficult to make new friends. But during those initial days of being the new kid on the block, I actually met a few of the kids on the block. One of the kids was Roy, who went to a private school, so we went to different schools. We met while I was biking down the street, and he asked if I had just moved into the house on the corner. We started hanging out from there. Then, a few days later, I met Hank. Hank actually rang the bell one day and asked my parents for me. I was confused when my parents called me to the door and introduced me to him. He said he lived down the block and wanted to know if I liked video games. Of course, I said yes, and he invited me over to his house to play Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. I didn't have that game but really wanted it, so I said yes. We walked to his house, which was literally the corner house at the opposite end of the block. Right away, I felt like the house looked less nice than every other house on the block. It was the same size as most, but it just looked run down and not taken care of. There was no grass. The front yard was just 2 big patches of dirt with a walkway cutting through them to the front door. We entered the house, and it was equally disheveled inside. It was like a house of hoarders, with boxes and junk everywhere in every room. He led us to the basement, which smelled like 15 cats lived down there. Weirdly enough, there didn't seem to be any pets. The basement was a pigsty. It may have been the messiest room in the house. We sat on this brown leather couch placed right in front of the TV. He had a GameCube and PS2. He booted up San Andreas, and we played the 2-player mode. It was actually fun, and in that moment, I thought I was going to like Hank and would want to be friends with him. Eventually, I wanted to go home, so I said I had to go. He seemed really disappointed, like he wanted to keep hanging out. We'd already been playing for like 2 hours, so I just wanted to go home. He followed me halfway home until I said, "See you later," basically saying in a friendly way, "All right, go away now." That was the first warning sign. I remember this kid Hank who lived down the block from me. One day, he rang my doorbell and asked if I could come out and play. I recall thinking he was a bit of a weirdo, but I didn't find it concerning just yet. The next day, Hank rang the doorbell again and asked my parents if I could come play. This time, we played GameCube in my room for about an hour. To be honest, I was starting to not really like him. I felt like he was weird and made me uncomfortable with how physically close he got to me. The next day after school, he rang the bell again. I wasn't really in the mood, so I told my mom to tell him I didn't feel good. He left, and I was relieved. I would rather hang out with my friend Roy, honestly, because I just liked him more. That same day, I rode my bike up to Roy's house to see if he could hang out. He was down, so we started riding our bikes further up the block. This was a mistake because as we passed Hank's house, he came outside onto his front stoop as if he were waiting by the window. It was weird, and it was also awkward because I had just had my mom tell him I was sick before. As we passed, I told Roy that I had hung out with that kid and that I felt like he was slightly weird. Roy was shocked that I had hung out with him, saying that whole family was crazy. I found out from Roy that Hank was actually a couple of years older than me. He was 12. From this point on, I decided to steer clear of him. The next weekend, Hank came to our door again, asking for me. I had told my mom before this already to tell him I'm not home if he came back, so she did that. But late that night, I woke up to my window completely open and a cool breeze blowing into the room. It was a chilly September night, so I most definitely left the window closed originally. Waking up to an unexpected breeze made me question who could have done that. Then I felt something poke my foot, and I screamed. I looked at the foot of my bed and saw Hank. He told me to be quiet, it's just him. Before I could even ask what he was doing in my room, he explained that his parents were fighting and he wanted to sleep with me. He climbed through my window. I was in shock. I told him to get out, and he pleaded with me to let him sleep in bed with me. Again, I told him to get out. Watching him turn and climb out of my window was a disturbing scene. I closed the window and locked it, and then went straight to my parents to wake them up and tell them. They couldn't believe it. The next day, my parents both went down the block to talk to Hank's parents, and when they came back, they said it didn't go well. Hank's crazy mom screamed and laughed in my parents' faces, taking no accountability for her son's actions. I'm sure my parents didn't want to get police involved because Hank was just a kid. But however many nights later, I woke up to knocks at my window. I had my blinds closed, but I knew for a fact it was Hank. I didn't answer the knocks, which went on and on for like 5 minutes. I even heard an attempt at opening the window. I was actually scared. I remember my heart racing. Eventually, the knock stopped. I went to tell my parents, and they told me to just ignore it. I think they weren't as threatened because, like I said before, Hank was just a kid. It was probably a few days later when Roy and I, along with another kid I made friends with from school, were biking from my house down the block, and when we passed Hank's house, I saw him run to the window as we passed. He just watched. I told my friends about what happened, and they found it hilarious. One of my friends made a comment about how he sounds like someone who would live in a gross house like that. That night, for the final time, I woke up to a sound in my room. It was the sound of my window being shattered. I screamed as I saw Hank climbing through the window through the closed blinds. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up. By this point, Hank was already back outside. My dad went outside and chased him all the way back to his house, with Hank making it back inside before my dad could catch up to him. My dad pounded on the door until Hank's parents opened up, and my dad must have said something right because he somehow managed to convince Hank's parents to pay for the window if he didn't involve the police. They ended up paying whatever it cost to fix the window, and I never heard from Hank again. Though I did see him once or twice in front of his house the next couple of years while in the car passing his house. That family eventually ended up moving somewhere else, thankfully. I think there's a chance Hank was looking to do something crazy, like murder me or at the very least attack me, just because he saw me hanging with other kids when I didn't want to be his friend. I mean, what else would he do after shattering my window with something and climbing inside? I'm scared to wonder what kind of person Hank grew up to be. In the quiet town of Briarwood, nestled among the rolling hills, there stood an ancient willow tree. Its sprawling branches reached towards the sky like gnarled fingers, casting eerie shadows over the neighborhood playground. Children were warned to stay away from the tree, for it was said to be cursed. But for Audrey and her friends, curiosity overcame fear. Audrey was 7 years old when she first heard about the legend of the Whispering Willow. It was whispered among the kids at school, a tale passed down from older siblings and cousins. They said that if you stood beneath the tree at midnight and listened closely, you could hear the whispers of lost souls trapped within its ancient roots. One fateful summer evening, Audrey and her two best friends, Imelda and Patrick, decided to test the legend. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they made their way to the playground where the willow stood sentinel in the moonlight. The air was thick with humidity as they approached the tree, its twisted branches swaying gently in the breeze. Audrey's heart raced in her chest as they huddled together beneath the willow's canopy. The playground was deserted, the only sounds the distant chirping of crickets. "Are you sure about this?" Imelda whispered, her voice trembling. Audrey nodded, her palms sweaty against the flashlight. "We have to do it together." On the count of 3. They took a deep breath, their anticipation palpable in the air. 1, 2, 3, Patrick exclaimed, and they switched off their flashlights, plunging themselves into darkness. For a moment, all was silent. Audrey strained her ears, hoping to catch a whisper, a murmur from the depths of the tree. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, she heard it, a soft, haunting whisper, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her heart, but as she listened, it grew louder, more insistent. "Help me, help me." The voice was plaintive, full of sorrow and despair. Audrey's blood ran cold as the words echoed in her mind. She could feel Imelda and Patrick tense beside her, their breaths shallow and ragged. The darkness seemed to press in around them, suffocating and oppressive. "We have to get out of here," Imelda whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. But before they could move, something shifted in the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct and ghostly. It floated towards them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Audrey's scream pierced the night as the figure reached out a translucent hand, its fingers curling towards her. She stumbled backward, tripping over a gnarled root and falling hard on the ground. "Run," Patrick shouted, grabbing Audrey's hand and pulling her to her feet. They sprinted towards the playground's exit, their hearts pounding in their chests. Behind them, the figure gave chase, its eerie whispers growing louder and more urgent. "Help me. Don't leave me." They burst out of the playground, gasping for breath as they stumbled onto the quiet street. The figure was gone, but the echoes of its voice lingered in their minds. They never spoke of that night again, each too terrified to confront the reality of what they had experienced. The Whispering Willow remained a forbidden place, a dark reminder of the unknown terrors that lurked in the shadows. Years passed, and Audrey grew into a young woman, the memory of that night fading like a distant dream. But one summer evening, as she walked past the playground on her way home, she heard it, a soft, haunting whisper carried on the breeze. "Help me." Audrey's blood turned to ice as she glanced towards the willow tree, its branches reaching towards the darkening sky. In that moment, she knew that some legends were born of truth, and that the whispering willow held secrets that were best left undisturbed. In the quaint town of Willowbrook, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a house unlike any other. It stood at the edge of town, its weathered facade looming ominously over the neighborhood. Children whispered tales of its haunted past, claiming that the shadows within held secrets darker than the night itself. It was here that young grave digger spent his childhood, unaware of the horrors that awaited him within those walls. Grave was an inquisitive child, always eager to explore the world around him. His parents, both busy with work, often left him to his own devices, trusting the safety of their small town. One summer afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, Grave found himself drawn to the mysterious house at the end of the street with a sense of curiosity that outweighed his fear. Grave pushed open the rusty gate and ventured into the overgrown yard. Weeds tangled around his ankles as he made his way to the front door, which creaked open with an eerie groan, as if welcoming him inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the only light filtering through dusty windows. Grave hesitated at the threshold, a chill creeping up his spine, but something compelled him forward, deeper into the belly of the house. As he stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. Whispers echoed off the walls, faint and indistinct, like the murmurs of a long-forgotten past. Grave's heart raced in his chest as he followed the sound, drawn to a staircase that spiraled upwards into darkness. With each step, the whispers grew louder, forming words that sent shivers down Grave's spine. "Leave," they hissed, "before it's too late." But Grave pressed on, driven by a morbid curiosity that overpowered his fear. At the top of the stairs, he found himself in a narrow corridor lined with closed doors. The whispers seemed to emanate from behind one in particular, its wood warped and splintered with age. Summoning all his courage, Grave pushed open the door to reveal a room frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture lay scattered about, cobwebs clinging to every surface. But what caught Grave's attention was the figure huddled in the corner, its back turned to him. "Hello," Grave called out, his voice trembling. The figure remained motionless, its form shrouded in darkness. Grave took a tentative step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he drew closer, he realized with horror that the figure was not human at all. It was a grotesque mannequin, its features contorted into a twisted mask of agony. In its outstretched hand, it held a faded photograph. Grave's hands shook as he took the photograph, his eyes widening in shock. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than himself, standing in front of the very house he now stood in. But what chilled him to the bone was the date on the back, the date of that very day, decades ago. Before he could comprehend the implications, the whispers around him grew deafening, a cacophony of anguished voices filling the room. "Help us," they moaned. "Free us from this place." Grave staggered back, his mind reeling with fear and confusion. Without a second thought, he turned and fled from the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. The echoes of the whispers haunted him every step of the way. When he emerged into the fading light of evening, he found himself in the overgrown yard once more. Gasping for breath, he stumbled towards the gate, desperate to escape the nightmare within. As he reached the gate, a sudden gust of wind slammed it shut with a resounding clang, sealing the house behind him. Grave looked back one last time, the house now looming like a dark specter against the twilight sky. From that day on, Grave avoided the house at the end of the street, the memory of the whispers and a haunting photograph etched into his mind forever. And though he grew up and left Willowbrook behind, he could never shake the feeling that something malevolent lingered within those walls, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim. To this day, the house remains untouched, a relic of a dark and tragic past. If you listen closely on quiet nights, you might just hear the whispers carried on the wind, a chilling reminder of the true stories that lie hidden within the shadows of childhoods long gone. As a child growing up in a small town nestled among dense woods, I often found myself drawn to the mysterious allure of the forest. But what I encountered there on one fateful day would haunt me for years to come. It was a warm summer afternoon, and my friends and I had decided to explore the woods behind our neighborhood. Armed with nothing but our youthful curiosity and a sense of adventure, we ventured deeper into the heart of the forest, eager to uncover its secrets. As we wandered among the towering trees and tangled undergrowth, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The air grew still, and the sounds of bird song and rustling leaves were replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to hang heavy in the air. Ignoring my growing sense of dread, I pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the whispers that seemed to echo through the trees. But as we reached a clearing in the forest, the source of the whispers became clear. A dilapidated old house hidden among the trees like a forgotten relic of the past. As we approached the house, a chill ran down my spine, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence, and the shadows seemed to dance with a life of their own. With trembling hands, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the darkness beyond. What I found inside would stay with me for the rest of my life. A room filled with decaying furniture and cobweb-covered relics of a bygone era. But it was what lay at the center of the room that filled me with terror. A child's doll, its eyes wide with a look of pure malevolence. And as I stared into those lifeless eyes, I felt a presence watching me from the shadows. A presence that seemed to hunger for something far more sinister than mere flesh and blood. With a cry of terror, I fled from the house, my friends close behind me. But even as we ran, I could still hear the whispers echoing through the woods, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk within. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that something evil dwells within those woods, something ancient and malevolent that preys on the innocent and the unsuspecting. And though I have long since left that small town behind, the memory of that day will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of our reality. As a child, my family lived in a sprawling old house with a basement that seemed to hold endless secrets. But it wasn't until one fateful night that I discovered the true horror lurking beneath our home. It was a stormy evening, and the wind howled outside as rain lashed against the windows. With the power out and the house plunged into darkness, my siblings and I huddled together in the living room, our hearts pounding with fear. But as the night wore on, an eerie sound began to echo through the house. A soft scratching coming from somewhere deep below. At first, we dismissed it as the sound of branches scraping against the windows, but as the scratching grew louder and more insistent, we knew something was terribly wrong. Summoning our courage, we ventured into the basement, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of dread. As we descended the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around us like a suffocating blanket. But what we found waiting for us in the depths of the basement was far worse than anything we could have imagined. A creature hunched and twisted, its eyes gleaming with malice as it lurked in the shadows. With a scream of terror, we fled from the basement, the creature hot on our heels. As we reached the safety of the main floor, we slammed the door shut behind us, praying that whatever lurked below would never escape its dark prison. To this day, I can still hear the scratching coming from the basement, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lurk just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. And though we have long since moved away from that house, the memory of that night will haunt me forever, a reminder of the darkness that dwells within us all.